The desert does not care who holds the map. It stretches the same in every direction, endless, exposed, indifferent. In North Africa during 1941, that indifference became a weapon. Supply lines were thin as thread. Water was rationed like ammunition. Engines inhaled sand. Men fought not only the enemy, but heat, distance, and the quiet pressure of isolation. And in the middle of that vastness stood Tobruk. Tobruk was not a capital. It was not a symbol in the way great cities become symbols. It was a port, a hard-edged harbor carved into the Libyan coastline, surrounded by defensive positions built earlier in the war. But in the campaign between Axis and Allied forces across the desert, Tobruk became something larger than geography. It became an anchor point. Whoever controlled it shaped movement across hundreds of miles of open terrain. When Axis forces under Erwin Rommel advanced rapidly across Cyrenaica in early 1941, they did so with momentum that unsettled British command. Town after town fell. Defensive lines were bypassed or shattered. The advance felt swift, almost improvised in its aggression. And yet, when Rommel reached Tobruk, he met something different. The garrison inside the port, largely Australian troops, later reinforced by British and other Allied units, did not collapse. They dug in. The defenses around Tobruk were layered: trenches, anti-tank ditches, strong points carved into rock and sand. The port allowed resupply by sea, even under constant threat from air and naval attack. The desert that had favored maneuver now complicated assault. Its Axis forces could encircle Tobruk, but taking it required breaching fortified lines under sustained resistance. Thus began the siege. It was not a single battle, but months of pressure. Axis artillery shelled positions relentlessly. Luftwaffe aircraft struck the harbor and defensive works. Probing attacks tested weak points. The defenders responded with counter-raids, patrols, and stubborn resistance that turned every assault into a calculation of cost. Inside Tobruk, life narrowed. Rations were measured carefully. Sleep was shallow and irregular. Dust coated everything. The constant presence of bombardment eroded nerves as surely as it damaged fortifications. The men inside began to call themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a name first intended as mockery by enemy propaganda, but adopted instead as a mark of endurance. Outside the perimeter, the desert war did not pause. Relief attempts were mounted. Armored formations maneuvered across vast distances, trying to break the encirclement. Some efforts failed. Others shifted the balance temporarily. Tobruk's survival became a strategic problem for the Axis. As long as it held, Rommel's supply lines remained extended and vulnerable. The port denied him a secure logistical hub for further advance toward Egypt. The siege became a contest of will as much as force. Axis assaults intensified periodically, testing whether fatigue had weakened resolve. Each time, defenders repelled attacks with coordinated artillery, machine gun fire, and localized counterattacks. Casualties mounted on both sides. The port suffered damage, but it did not fall. Months stretched into endurance. Heat gave way to cooler winds, and replacements rotated in and out by sea when possible. Naval convoys risked submarine and air attack to keep the garrison supplied. The siege was not static. It pulsed with violence, uncertainty, and long intervals of tension, where the next assault could come at any hour. Eventually, broader Allied offensives in the desert shifted the equation. Pressure from outside forced Axis forces to withdraw. The siege lifted not because Tobruk collapsed, but because it endured long enough for the strategic picture to change. The Siege of Tobruk mattered beyond its immediate tactical significance. It disrupted Axis momentum. It consumed resources. It became a symbol of resistance in a theater where rapid advance had seemed inevitable. For the men inside the perimeter, yes, it was less about symbolism and more about survival, about holding ground under conditions that tested endurance daily. For the commanders shaping the wider campaign, Tobruk was a pivot around which the Desert War turned. The complete history of the Siege of Tobruk is not just a chronicle of attacks and defenses. It is a study in persistence, in how isolation can either fracture resolve or harden it, in how a port carved into rock can become the fulcrum of a continent-spanning campaign, in how wars are often decided not only by dramatic breakthroughs, but by places that refuse to yield. This is the story of the Siege of Tobruk, months of pressure beneath a desert sky, where endurance altered the trajectory of the North African campaign. Before continuing, pause for a moment and notice your surroundings. And is the air around you still or moving? Are you at the beginning of your day, deep in the middle of it, or winding down toward rest? Just register it quietly. Tobruk endured through long stretches where time felt heavy. Let this story unfold without rushing past that weight. January 6th, 1941. Australian soldiers of the 9th Division stepped off transport trucks into what should have been a battle-scarred wasteland. Instead, they found something that made no sense: wine cellars stocked with Italian vintages, kitchens with pots still on the stove, an underground hospital carved into coastal rock with 400 beds, surgical theaters lit by electric generators, and medical supplies for an army that had simply vanished. The Italians had built a fortress designed to hold 60,000 men, and then abandoned it without firing a shot. Lieutenant Colonel John Murray walked through the main fortification and wrote in his diary that night, "We have inherited a city built for war." No one yet understood that this accidental inheritance would become the most contested piece of earth in North Africa. Tobruk itself was never supposed to matter. The harbor sat on the Libyan coast, a horseshoe-shaped indent in the Mediterranean shoreline that Italian colonial engineers had blasted and dredged starting in 1934. The work took 6 years. They carved docks directly into limestone cliffs, built reinforced warehouses resistant to aerial bombardment, and installed underground fuel storage tanks beneath 30 feet of solid rock. The harbor could accommodate destroyers at its deepest point, which measured 36 feet at low tide. Between Alexandria in Egypt and Tripoli in Libya stretched over 1,000 miles of coastline without a single deep-water port capable of supplying a modern army. Tobruk was the only exception. The Italians understood this. They built accordingly. What they apparently never planned for was actually having to defend it against a determined enemy. The defensive perimeter the Australians now occupied formed a rough semicircle around the harbor, stretching nearly 30 miles from anchor point to anchor point on the coast. Italian engineers had constructed 138 concrete pillboxes, each positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire across the barren ground. Anti-tank ditches scarred the landscape, some excavated to depths of 12 feet and widths of 15 feet, in zigzagging across likely approach routes. 3 concentric belts of barbed wire barriers stood before the main defensive line. The outer works included firing positions for artillery, mortar pits protected by sandbag revetments, and observation posts built into the highest points of the escarpment that ring the southern approaches. The Italians had even laid minefields, though the density proved insufficient by later standards. Walking this perimeter for the first time, Australian officers realized they faced an immediate problem. 36,000 Commonwealth troops now garrisoned defenses designed for at least 60,000. Every mile of front required constant manning. There were no reserves. General Thomas Blamey, commanding Australian forces in the Middle East, understood the arithmetic immediately. His intelligence officers presented him with maps showing the defensive layout, and he spent an entire afternoon calculating spacing, response times, and the minimum force necessary to hold against a determined assault. The numbers did not work. If enemy forces attacked multiple points simultaneously, the defenders would lack sufficient troops to reinforce threatened sectors quickly enough. The perimeter was simply too large for the available garrison. Yet abandoning Tobruk meant surrendering the only port between Alexandria and Tripoli, which would give any advancing enemy an uninterrupted supply line along the entire Libyan coast. General Archibald Wavell, commanding all British and Commonwealth forces in the Middle East, made the decision in early February. Tobruk would be held. The alternative was accepting eventual Axis control of all North Africa. The water situation presented an immediate concern that would only worsen with time. Ancient Roman cisterns still existed beneath the town, testament to 2,000 years of human habitation in a place where water never came easily. Italian engineers had supplemented these with modern wells drilled to depths exceeding 100 feet, punching through limestone to reach brackish aquifers below. The combined system produced approximately 40,000 gallons daily under optimal conditions. A garrison of 36,000 men required that much just for drinking and cooking, leaving nothing for bathing, laundry, vehicle maintenance, or the cooling systems of generators that powered everything from searchlights to surgical equipment. Water would be rationed from the first day. Every drop would be measured, tracked, and fought over. On February 6, 1941, reconnaissance aircraft photographed something that changed every calculation. At Tripoli, 900 miles to the west, ships were unloading German tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. The photographs showed organized efficiency rather than chaotic improvisation. German troops moved with purpose. Equipment arrived in quantity. This was not a token force sent to stiffen Italian resolve. This was the beginning of a German commitment to North Africa, and it had a name that would soon become synonymous with desert warfare: the Afrika Korps. The commander's name appeared in intelligence reports almost immediately: General Lieutenant Erwin Rommel, a Panzer Division commander who had distinguished himself during the invasion of France. British intelligence officers compiled a profile: aggressive, unconventional, willing to take risks that more cautious commanders avoided. The assessment concluded with a warning: Rommel would not wait to build up strength before attacking. He would move as soon as he believed movement was possible. The Australians settling into Tobruk's defenses came primarily from the 9th Division, a formation that had trained in Palestine and Egypt but had not yet faced German forces in combat. They were volunteer soldiers, citizens of a country 12,000 miles away, who had enlisted to fight in a war that had not yet directly threatened Australian soil. Many were from rural areas. They knew how to work with minimal resources, all improvise solutions to unexpected problems, and maintain equipment under harsh conditions. These skills would matter more than anyone initially realized. The division included the 20th, 24th, and 26th Brigades, with supporting artillery, engineer, and supply units. Also present were British infantry battalions, Indian troops, and a Polish Carpathian brigade that had reached the Middle East after escaping Soviet-occupied Poland through Iran. This multinational garrison shared one common understanding: they were a very long way from any reinforcement. General Leslie Morshead took command of the Tobruk garrison in March 1941. He was 41 years old, a veteran of the First World War, who had commanded a battalion at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. His reputation emphasized thorough preparation, and strict discipline, and an unwillingness to accept excuses when tasks went uncompleted. He immediately ordered improvements to the defensive positions. Existing minefields were expanded and mapped with obsessive precision. Anti-tank ditches were deepened where geology permitted. Concrete pillboxes received additional camouflage and overhead protection against aerial bombardment. Morshead understood that Italian engineering had provided a foundation, but holding against German assault would require transforming those foundations into something far more formidable. He gave his officers 1 month to complete the work. They would get 3 weeks. The strategic importance of Tobruk derived entirely from geography and timing. If Axis forces controlled the port, they could shorten their supply line by 600 miles, bringing fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements directly to the front rather than trucking everything from Tripoli. For British and Commonwealth forces, Tobruk's value was defensive. As long as it remained in Allied hands, any Axis advance into Egypt had to detour around a fortified position in their rear, maintaining a dangerous salient that threatened supply columns and tied down troops needed elsewhere. The town itself held no intrinsic value. Tobruk was not a population center, not an industrial hub, not agriculturally productive. It was a harbor with defensive works, nothing more. Yet the mathematics of desert warfare transformed that harbor into the most valuable piece of ground in Libya. The men now occupying these positions could not have known they were about to become part of one of the longest sieges of the Second World War. They cleaned weapons, they filled sandbags, strung barbed wire, and waited. At night, they could see stars undimmed by any artificial light beyond their own fortifications. The Mediterranean stretched northward, dark and empty. To the west lay 900 miles of desert, and somewhere in that expanse, German tanks were moving east. The waiting would not last long. History was already in motion, and Tobruk stood directly in its path. The fortress that shouldn't exist was about to discover exactly why it had to. March 31st, 1941. Erwin Rommel sat in the observer's seat of a Fiesler Storch reconnaissance aircraft, circling 2,000 feet above Tobruk. Below him, the British defensive perimeter spread in a rough semicircle, positions marked by the shadows they cast in the afternoon sun. He had a notebook balanced on his knee, and making sketches of approach routes and potential breakthrough points. The pilot maintained a wide orbit, staying beyond effective anti-aircraft range, while Rommel studied the ground that obsessed him. He had been in North Africa for exactly 6 weeks. In that time, he had driven British forces back nearly 500 miles, recaptured all the territory Italy had lost, and now stared down at the one position that refused to collapse. His original orders from Berlin had been explicit: halt at Aghdabia, consolidate, and wait for reinforcements. Rommel had ignored those orders the moment he sensed British weakness. Now he faced the consequence of his own success. A fortified port in his rear, garrisoned by troops who showed no inclination to retreat. The speed of Rommel's advance had shocked both sides, and German forces crossed into Cyrenaica on March 24th, and within 2 weeks they had reached Tobruk's outer perimeter. Some units averaged 100 miles per day across terrain that German staff officers in Berlin had assumed would slow movement to a crawl. Rommel achieved this by ignoring logistical orthodoxy. His tanks outran their supply columns. His infantry traveled on whatever trucks could be commandeered, captured, or improvised. When fuel ran low, he ordered captured British stocks used without testing compatibility. The approach worked because British forces were retreating too quickly to organize coherent resistance. By the time Commonwealth commanders realized what was happening, German reconnaissance units were already operating along the coastal road to Egypt. And the only significant formation that remained in Cyrenaica was the garrison hurriedly assembling inside Tobruk. Hitler's directive arrived on April 2nd, transmitted through high command channels and marked urgent. The message was unambiguous. Rommel was to halt immediately, establish a defensive line, and under no circumstances attempt to assault Tobruk until reinforcements arrived and proper siege artillery was brought forward. The directive reflected concerns in Berlin about overextension, supply line vulnerability, and the risk of committing German prestige to an operation that might fail. Rommel read the order, acknowledged receipt, and then made a decision that would define the next 8 months. He would attack Tobruk within the week. His reasoning appeared in the war diary he maintained throughout the campaign. British forces were disorganized, their morale shaken by continuous retreat. Tobruk's defenses, while extensive, were not yet fully manned or improved. A swift assault might carry the position before defenders could properly establish themselves. Delay would only allow the British to strengthen fortifications, bring in reinforcements, and prepare for siege warfare. The logic was characteristically Rommel, audacious, opportunistic, and utterly convinced that speed trumped preparation. The Africa Corps that assembled for the first assault on Tobruk numbered approximately 50,000 men, including German and Italian formations. Rommel had roughly 150 tanks operational, mostly Panzer Mark IIIs with 50mm guns, and Panzer Mark IVs with shorter 75mm weapons. Supporting artillery included captured British guns alongside German pieces, creating a logistical nightmare for ammunition supply. The Italian contingent provided additional manpower, but equipment that was generally inferior to both German and British equivalents. Rommel's plan called for a rapid penetration on the southern perimeter, exploitation toward the harbor, and the collapse of defensive coherence before British commanders could organize counterattacks. He believed the operation would take 3 days. On April 10th, he sent a message to Berlin announcing his intention to commence the assault. On April 11th, he sent another message predicting Tobruk would fall within 72 hours. He was wrong. The first assault began before dawn on April 14th, 1941. But German artillery opened fire at 0445 hours, targeting Australian positions on the southwestern sector of the perimeter. The barrage lasted 30 minutes. Then German infantry advanced with tank support toward positions designated R6 and R7 on Australian defensive maps. The attack followed predictable patterns: armor leading, infantry following in the gaps, engineers prepared to breach obstacles. What Rommel apparently did not anticipate was that Australian defenders had spent 2 weeks improving fields of fire, pre-sighting anti-tank guns, and mapping exact ranges to every piece of terrain that offered cover to approaching vehicles. The German tanks rolled into a killing ground where every weapon was already trained on pre-designated firing zones. Sergeant Ray Sandover commanded a 2-pounder anti-tank gun crew at Post R6. He later described watching German tanks emerge from the dawn mist at approximately 800 yards range. His crew held fire. At 600 yards, the tanks were clearly visible but still beyond the effective range where the 2-pounder could guarantee penetration. At 400 yards, Sandover gave the order to engage. His crew destroyed 7 Panzermarks 3 in 12 minutes, the gunner methodically tracking each target while the loader maintained a rhythm that barely paused between rounds. Other crews along the same sector reported similar results. The German armor had advanced into terrain where defenders enjoyed every advantage: known ranges, prepared positions, and interlocking fire that prevented enemy tanks from concentrating against any single position. By mid-morning, 17 German tanks were burning or disabled within view of the Australian front line. The infantry assault fared no better. German soldiers attempting to follow their armor found themselves pinned in the anti-tank ditch, which proved deeper and wider than reconnaissance had suggested. Italian Bersaglieri troops, assigned to support the main German thrust, refused to advance after taking casualties from machine gun fire at ranges beyond which they could effectively return fire. The attack stalled by early afternoon. Rommel, observing from a forward command post, made a decision that nearly cost him his life. He personally led a counterattack attempting to rally stalled units, driving his staff car forward until British artillery bracketed his position. The vehicle took shrapnel damage. Rommel escaped injury, but was forced to withdraw. By nightfall on April 14th, the first assault had failed completely. German casualties approached 250 killed and wounded. 23 tanks were total losses. Territorial gains measured less than 800 yards at the deepest penetration point. The failure should have prompted reconsideration. Instead, Rommel ordered renewed attacks over the following days, each attempting to exploit different sectors of the perimeter. On April 16th, German forces attacked the Western Salient. On April 30th through May 1st, they achieved a limited penetration, creating a bulge nearly 1 mile deep before Australian counterattacks restored the line. Throughout these operations, a pattern emerged. German tactical skill could achieve local breakthroughs, but the defenders possessed sufficient reserves to contain penetrations before they became decisive. The perimeter was simply too strong, too well prepared, and too stubbornly defended to collapse under the forces Rommel could currently deploy. Intelligence estimates suggested taking Tobruk by assault would require at least double the German strength currently available, plus siege artillery heavy enough to systematically reduce fortified positions, plus air superiority sufficient to prevent British naval resupply. Rommel possessed none of these prerequisites. By early May, the immediate crisis had passed, and both sides settled into siege warfare neither had particularly wanted. German forces established blocking positions around the perimeter, but lacked sufficient strength to maintain constant pressure at all points. The Australians held the fortress but remained isolated, dependent on nighttime naval supply runs for everything from ammunition to food to medical supplies. Rommel's 3-day prediction had become a weeks-long stalemate that showed no sign of resolution. His supply situation was deteriorating. Fuel stocks barely sufficed for current operations, let alone the offensive actions he preferred. The British were sinking Italian cargo ships faster than the Axis could replace them. Every liter of fuel consumed besieging Tobruk was fuel unavailable for operations elsewhere. The mathematics were unforgiving, and Rommel's gamble was failing, but he would not let go. Tobruk had become an obsession, and obsessions rarely respond to logic. The siege had only just begun. 0545 hours, April 14th, 1941. Corporal Jack Edmondson peered through the pre-dawn darkness at post R6, watching shapes materialize from the gray light. Mist hung low across the desert, reducing visibility to perhaps 300 yards. Then the shapes resolved into Panzer, Mark III tanks, hull down behind slight rises in the ground, advancing in a ragged line toward the Australian positions. Edmondson's platoon had been awake for an hour, positioned in fighting trenches with orders to hold fire until targets reached designated killing zones. Machine guns were loaded, ammunition belts checked, range cards memorized. Every man knew exactly where to aim, exactly when to fire, and exactly what would happen when those tanks closed the distance. The waiting was almost over. The German artillery barrage that preceded the assault had been intense but poorly targeted. Shells fell across a wide area, some impacting hundreds of yards behind the front line, where only empty deserts absorbed the explosions. The Australians had learned from previous bombardments to disperse and take cover in deeper fighting positions, rather than the forward trenches that drew the most fire. Casualties during the barrage numbered fewer than 20 across the entire targeted sector. When the barrage lifted and German armor began its approach, Australian defenders emerged from covered positions and manned weapons that had been protected from shell fragments by overhead cover and sandbag revetments. The Germans had announced their attack with 30 minutes of artillery fire, then assaulted positions that were fully manned and ready. The anti-tank guns opened fire first. 2-pounder weapons had effective ranges around 800 yards under ideal conditions, but accuracy and penetration both improved dramatically at closer distances. Australian gun crews had spent days calculating exact ranges to terrain features across their front. A slight rise at 420 yards, a patch of harder ground at 380 yards, a small wadi at 250 yards. When German tanks crossed these invisible lines, gunners engaged with precision that came from endless practice and motivation, sharpened by the understanding that missing meant dying. The 2-pounder fired a solid shot rather than an explosive shell, relying on kinetic energy to punch through armor. Against the Panzer, Mark III's frontal armor, penetration was possible, but not guaranteed beyond 400 yards. Inside that range, the 2-pounder was lethal. Sergeant Ray Sandover's gun crew achieved something approaching perfection that morning. Their position overlooked a natural approach route where the ground dipped slightly before rising toward the defensive line, terrain that looked like cover to an advancing tank, but actually created a kill zone where vehicles were momentarily silhouetted against the lighter sky beyond. Sandover's gunner, a sheep farmer from New South Wales named Jim Gordon, had the timing memorized. Tank appears on the rise, lead it slightly as it descends, fire as it begins climbing the far slope when the hull is exposed and the driver cannot reverse quickly. At least 7 tanks entered that kill zone during the first hour of fighting. All 7 were hit, and 5 burned. The remaining 2 were immobilized with damaged tracks or running gear. Gordon later said he felt nothing during the engagement except concentration on the next target. The emotional impact came afterward. The German infantry following the tanks found themselves in an impossible situation. The anti-tank ditch that looked like a simple obstacle on reconnaissance photographs proved to be 12 feet deep with nearly vertical sides, the bottom littered with rubble and broken concrete that made movement difficult and crossing impossible without engineering equipment. German soldiers who jumped into the ditch seeking cover from machine gun fire found themselves trapped. On Australian positions on the far side had clear fields of fire directly into the ditch. Several German units attempted to surrender from the ditch floor, but could not make themselves heard over the ongoing firing. Others tried to climb out and were shot. The ditch became a death trap, and German commanders watching from rear positions could do nothing to extract men who had advanced too far without adequate support. Italian forces assigned to support the main German thrust performed poorly, though the reasons remain debated among historians. The Ariete Division, considered among the better Italian formations in North Africa, advanced toward Australian positions on the eastern flank of the main attack. They encountered concentrated machine gun fire at ranges approaching 800 yards and took casualties immediately. Italian officers attempted to rally their men for a continued advance, but the formations broke and retreated after gaining less than 200 yards. Whether this reflected poor morale, inadequate training, inferior equipment, or simply rational assessment of a hopeless tactical situation depends on which sources one consults. The operational result was clear. The Italian supporting attack failed to materialize, leaving German units advancing without flank protection. By mid-morning, the attack had stalled completely. German tanks that had penetrated beyond the anti-tank ditch found themselves isolated, their infantry support unable to follow, and Australian positions to their rear preventing withdrawal. Several tank commanders attempted to reverse out of the fire zone, but multiple vehicles threw tracks on rough ground or were disabled by additional anti-tank fire. The Luftwaffe appeared overhead around 1000 hours. Messerschmitt B, F-109s providing top cover, while Junkers Ju-87s attempted dive-bombing attacks on Australian positions. The bombing achieved little. Dispersed defenders in well-prepared positions were nearly impossible to hit, with the bombing accuracy available in 1941. German aircraft losses numbered 4 confirmed destroyed, with several others damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Rommel himself arrived at a forward observation post around 1400 hours, attempting to assess whether the attack could be renewed with any prospect of success. What he saw was unambiguous: German tanks burning across a front of roughly 2 miles, infantry pinned in the anti-tank ditch or scattered in small groups trying to find cover, Australian positions largely intact and returning fire with undiminished intensity. The Easter assault had failed, and no amount of German tactical skill or leadership could salvage it without reinforcements and resources that simply did not exist. Rommel gave orders to withdraw and consolidate. The survivors pulled back under covering fire from artillery, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and casualties that could not be recovered under direct observation from Australian positions. The butcher's bill arrived over the following days as both sides counted losses. German casualties approached 250 killed and wounded, though exact figures remain uncertain because some records were lost, and German after-action reports tended to understate losses. Tank losses were harder to obscure. 23 Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs were total write-offs, destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. That represented roughly 15% of Rommel's available armor. Italian casualties added another 400 men to the total, most from the Ariete Division's failed supporting attack. Australian casualties were substantially lighter: 39 killed, 82 wounded across the units engaged in the heaviest fighting. The disparity reflected the fundamental advantage of prepared defense against hasty assault. Attackers absorbed casualties crossing open ground under observed fire. Defenders remained in covered positions, firing at targets advancing toward them. The Easter battle established patterns that would repeat throughout the siege. German forces could achieve tactical surprise and local breakthroughs through superior training and aggressive leadership, but they lacked the overwhelming strength necessary to turn penetrations into collapse. Australian defenders demonstrated that infantry with adequate anti-tank weapons, fighting from prepared positions with good fields of fire, could stop German armor. The perimeter held not because of any single dramatic moment, but because thousands of soldiers in hundreds of positions did exactly what needed doing when it needed doing. The mathematics of the siege were beginning to clarify. Tobruk would not fall to assault. It would have to be starved into submission. And that meant a very different kind of warfare was about to begin. April 20th, day 1941. In a dugout 6 feet below the surface of the Libyan desert, Australian soldiers huddled around a salvaged wireless receiver, listening to a broadcast from Nazi Germany. The voice belonged to William Joyce, an American-born fascist broadcasting propaganda under the name Lord Haw Haw, from a studio in Hamburg. His plummy, affected accent dripped with condescension as he addressed British and Commonwealth forces fighting in North Africa. The garrison at Tobruk, Joyce announced, consisted of nothing more than poor desert rats trapped and waiting to be captured. The soldiers listening exchanged glances. Someone laughed. Someone else suggested that being called rats was probably accurate. They lived underground, came out at night, and annoyed the enemy considerably. Within hours, the name had spread across the entire perimeter. The Rats of Tobruk. It fit perfectly. William Joyce had been broadcasting since September 1939, his shows designed to demoralize Allied troops and undermine civilian morale in Britain. His nickname came from his signature opening phrase, "Germany calling, Germany calling." Listeners heard "Germany calling" in his peculiar accent, which led British newspapers to dub him Lord Haw Haw in mockery of his affected delivery. Joyce's broadcasts mixed factual news with distortions, half-truths, and outright fabrications intended to make Allied military situations seem hopeless. He had previously targeted British soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk, French forces after the fall of France, and now Commonwealth troops in North Africa. What Joyce apparently never understood was that soldiers respond to propaganda very differently than intended when the propaganda is absurdly disconnected from their actual experience. Calling men trapped in Tobruk poor desert rats, when those same men had just thrown back German armored assaults, struck the Australians as darkly funny rather than demoralizing. The transformation of an insult into a badge of pride happened organically, without official endorsement or organized campaign. Soldiers began chalking rat drawings on concrete pillboxes. Maintenance crews painted crude rat insignias on vehicle sides. Within days, the image had evolved. The rat wore a German helmet or carried a rifle, or was depicted gnawing on a tank track. The humor was rough, and soldiers found it hilarious. These were men who had volunteered to fight in a war on the other side of the world, who were now besieged in a desert fortress, living in holes in the ground and being bombed daily by the Luftwaffe. Finding dark comedy in being called rats seemed entirely appropriate to their situation. The name stuck because it captured something true about their circumstances and their response to those circumstances. Chester Wilmot, an Australian war correspondent attached to the 9th Division, recognized the propaganda value immediately. Wilmot had been filing dispatches from Tobruk since early April, his reports distributed through Australian and British newspapers. On April 23rd, he filed a story specifically about the Lord Haw Haw broadcast and the Australian reaction to it. The men of Tobruk have embraced the name the enemy gave them, Wilmot wrote. They are the Desert Rats, and they wear the title with pride. The story resonated with audiences desperate for any positive news from a war that had delivered mostly defeats and withdrawals. Here were Australian soldiers laughing at Nazi propaganda, turning insults into emblems, and holding a fortress that Rommel himself could not crack. The story spread through Commonwealth newspapers, then international press. Within weeks, the Rats of Tobruk had become a recognized symbol of defiance. General Leslie Morshead's response to the adopted nickname revealed his understanding of morale's importance in siege warfare. When asked by a visiting staff officer whether he planned to discourage the Rats identification as potentially demeaning, and Morshead reportedly replied, "They can call us whatever they like. We're not leaving." The comment was vintage Morshead, terse, unambiguous, and focused entirely on the mission rather than perception. He understood that soldiers who saw themselves as defiant rats gnawing at Rommel's plans were soldiers with the mental resilience to endure months of siege. The nickname was self-deprecating enough to remain authentically soldier-generated rather than imposed from above, yet prideful enough to serve as genuine motivation. Mooreshead let it grow naturally. The garrison that embraced the Rat's identity was more diverse than popular memory sometimes acknowledges. Of the roughly 36,000 troops holding Tobruk in April 1941, approximately 14,000 were Australians from the 9th Division. The remainder included 8,000 British infantry from various battalions, 4,000 Indian troops, and a Polish Carpathian brigade numbering approximately 5,000 men. The Polish brigade had reached the Middle East through an extraordinary journey, escaping Soviet-occupied Poland, traveling through Iran, and ultimately joining Commonwealth forces in North Africa. They had their own reasons for fighting Germans with particular intensity. Yet, the Rats of Tobruk identification became predominantly Australian in public memory, partly because Australian journalists like Wilmot promoted it, and partly because the 9th Division would serve the longest continuous period in Tobruk before eventual relief. Mail delivery became a critical morale factor. And the statistics tell their own story about maintaining connections to home during siege conditions. Royal Navy destroyers making supply runs to Tobruk carried more than ammunition and food. They transported approximately 30,000 letters per week, arriving from Australia, Britain, India, and Poland. The letters took 6 to 8 weeks to reach Tobruk from Australia, meaning soldiers read about family events that had happened weeks or months prior. Many letters crossed with news that had since changed. Soldiers learned about births, marriages, deaths, and ordinary family dramas in delayed installments that made the distance feel even greater. Yet, receiving mail mattered enormously. Men who received letters showed measurably better morale than those who did not. The connection to home, however delayed and fragmentary, it reminded them they remained part of something larger than the siege. The first formal organization calling itself the Rats of Tobruk Association formed in May 1941, while the siege was still ongoing. A group of Australian soldiers drew up mock constitution documents, elected a president from among their sergeants, and declared their intention to maintain the association after the war ended. The Constitution's preamble, written on salvaged Italian paperwork, stated that membership was open to any soldier who had served inside the Tobruk perimeter during siege conditions. The whole thing started as a joke, a way to pass time between bombardments and patrols. But, like the nickname itself, the joke contained something genuine. These men understood they were experiencing something unusual, something that would define their service and their lives afterward. The association they created as dark humor in May 1941 would eventually grow to include over 8,000 members and persist for decades after the war. The German propaganda apparatus never successfully countered the Rats narrative, despite multiple attempts. Subsequent broadcasts from Hamburg tried different approaches, calling the defenders Churchill's doomed garrison or the forgotten army of Tobruk. None of these alternatives gained any traction. The Rats nickname had emerged organically from the soldiers themselves, and that authenticity made it impossible to dislodge through external messaging. German intelligence officers analyzing Allied morale eventually concluded that the Tobruk garrison possessed unusually high cohesion and fighting spirit, though they apparently never connected this observation to the identity-building effect of their own propaganda. The poor desert rats, trapped and waiting to be captured, had instead trapped their besiegers in a grinding attritional struggle that Rommel could neither win decisively nor abandon safely. By late April, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a propaganda insult had become one of the most effective morale symbols of the entire North African campaign. Soldiers who might have felt forgotten, isolated, and increasingly desperate instead felt part of something proud and defiant. The Rats lived underground, survived on minimal resources, were impossible to exterminate, and bit back when attacked. The metaphor worked on every level. It worked so well that more than 80 years later, the Rats of Tobruk remain a recognized symbol in Australian military history and national memory. Lord Haw Haw had tried to demoralize defenders, Instead, he gave them exactly the identity they needed to endure what was coming. The siege was just beginning, and the rats were settling in for a very long fight. April 30th, 1941, 2200 hours. German infantry from the 5th Light Division moved through darkness toward the western sector of the Tobruk perimeter, advancing in small groups with orders to maintain absolute silence. No artillery preparation preceded this attack. No tank engines announced the assault. The Germans were attempting infiltration rather than breakthrough, probing for the weakness that commanders suspected existed somewhere in the 30-mile defensive arc. They found it at posts S7 and S8, where the perimeter bulged outward in a salient nearly 3 miles deep. The position had troubled Australian commanders since they first surveyed the defenses. The salient created a bulge that could not be adequately observed from flanking positions, required disproportionate manpower to defend, and offered attackers the possibility of penetrating deep enough to threaten the entire defensive system. Tonight, German tactical instincts had led them straight to that vulnerability. The geography of the Western Salient created problems that no amount of engineering could fully solve. The perimeter followed the line of Italian-built fortifications, which had been positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across relatively flat approaches. But the western sector included rougher terrain, with wadis, rises, and dead ground that blocked observation. The salient itself protruded nearly 2 8/10 miles beyond the smoother defensive arc elsewhere, forming a bulge approximately 4 miles wide at its base. Defending this bulge required troops positioned where they could not easily support each other, separated by terrain that prevented direct observation, holding ground that seemed to exist primarily to create tactical complications. Australian engineers had improved the position as much as possible: thicker minefields, deeper anti-tank ditches, additional wire barriers, but the fundamental problem remained. The salient was an invitation to attack, and eventually someone would accept that invitation. The German assault achieved surprise through tactics rather than deception. Australian listening posts detected movement around midnight, but could not determine strength or objective in the darkness. By 0100 hours on May 1st, German infantry had reached the outer wire barriers and were cutting through with practiced efficiency. The minefields that should have stopped them proved less dense than elsewhere on the perimeter, only 12 mines per 100 yards compared to 30 or 40 in better prepared sectors. German engineers had probed the field during daylight hours from distant observation points, mapping the pattern of surface disturbances that indicated mine placement. Now they moved through gaps with confidence that came from accurate intelligence. By 0200 hours, German troops had penetrated 1 mile into the perimeter and were consolidating around captured posts, S7 and S8. Lieutenant Austin McKell commanded an Australian platoon positioned at an outpost that suddenly found itself behind German lines. McKell's force numbered 31 men occupying a captured Italian pillbox that had been reinforced with sandbags and converted into a strong point. When he realized German troops had penetrated beyond his position, McKell faced a decision that had no good options: attempt to withdraw and risk being caught in the open during daylight, remain in place and hope the penetration would be quickly contained, or defend the position and tie down German forces that might otherwise exploit deeper into the perimeter. McKell chose to fight. His platoon had food for 3 days, then ammunition for perhaps 2 days of intense combat, and a concrete bunker that would withstand anything short of direct artillery hit. They settled in and waited for dawn. The Australian counterattack launched on the night of May 3rd, after 2 days of frantic preparation. Artillery ammunition was rationed throughout the siege, and commanders hesitated to expend shells on preparatory bombardment when reserves were already critically low. The assault would rely on infantry with bayonets, advancing at night, attempting to retake ground through close combat rather than firepower. The 18th Brigade drew the assignment with specific orders to restore the perimeter and eliminate the German penetration before it could be reinforced. The attacking force numbered approximately 1 battalion, perhaps 800 men, advancing toward positions now held by an estimated 1,200 German defenders who had 2 days to dig in and prepare. The fighting that followed matched the brutality of any close-quarters combat in the Second World War. Australian troops advanced through darkness, navigating by compass bearing and landmarks memorized from aerial photographs. German defenders held fire until attackers were within grenade range, then opened up with machine guns at point-blank distances. The Australians kept coming. Bayonet fighting occurred in trenches and around concrete fortifications, men killing each other at arm's length in darkness broken only by muzzle flashes and burning equipment. And the Australian official history records 189 casualties, killed and wounded, in the counterattack that retook 800 yards of perimeter. German casualties went unrecorded in available sources, but positions captured the following morning contained evidence of desperate fighting. The perimeter was restored, but the salient remained vulnerable. Historians have documented an extraordinary moment that occurred during the height of the fighting. A German field hospital was discovered operating 400 yards inside the original perimeter, treating casualties from both sides. Medical officers and orderlies from opposing armies worked in the same space, following the protocols of the Geneva Convention, while combat raged nearby. Australian wounded were given the same treatment as German casualties. At the morphine administered without regard to uniform, surgery performed based on medical need rather than nationality. The field hospital operated for approximately 18 hours before Australian infantry secured the area, at which point German medical personnel formally surrendered, and their patients were evacuated to Australian medical facilities. The incident illustrated something often obscured by the brutality of siege warfare. Professional soldiers on both sides generally respected the laws of war, even when fighting with maximum intensity. Lieutenant McKell's platoon was relieved on May 4th after holding their isolated position for 3 days. They had survived on emergency rations, fired every round of ammunition they possessed, and withstood multiple German attempts to force their surrender. When Australian troops finally reached the position, they found McKell's men exhausted but defiant, the pillbox surrounded by German casualties from failed assault attempts. McKell received a military cross for his defense of the position, though his recommendation letter noted that every man in the platoon deserved recognition for what they had endured. The platoon stand had prevented German forces from using their strong point as a base for deeper penetration, buying time for the counterattack to organize. The salient remained a permanent vulnerability in the Tobruk defenses, recognized by both sides as the most likely point for renewed German assault. Australian engineers worked continuously to improve the position. Minefield density increased to 45 mines per 100 yards by October. All anti-tank ditches were deepened and widened where soil conditions permitted. Additional barbed wire barriers were installed in multiple belts, but the fundamental geometry remained unchanged. The salient bulged outward, terrain blocked observation, and attackers possessed the initiative to choose timing and concentration of force. German planning documents captured later in the war confirmed that every subsequent assault plan targeted the salient as the primary breakthrough point. The Easter battle had tested the southern perimeter. The May fighting had exposed the Western Salient's weakness. Both sides now understood the ground intimately, and that knowledge would shape everything that followed. The cost of holding the salient became clear in casualty statistics compiled over the following months. The western sector, and representing approximately 15% of the total perimeter length, accounted for roughly 40% of Australian defensive casualties during May and June. Soldiers rotating into salient positions understood they were entering the most dangerous ground in Tobruk, where German patrols probed nightly. Artillery fire was constant, and the geometry of the terrain favored attackers. Yet, the position had to be held. Abandoning the salient meant shortening the defensive perimeter, but also meant bringing German forces nearly 3 miles closer to the harbor and potentially allowing observation of shipping movements that currently remained hidden behind the coastal escarpment. The mathematics were unforgiving. The salient was simultaneously the weakest point in the defenses and too valuable to surrender. It would be defended, whatever the cost, for as long as the siege continued. June 12, 1941, 05:30 hours. Private Bill Winnett crawled out of his dugout into the pre-dawn darkness and joined the queue forming at the water point. Each man carried a salvage petrol can, 4 gallons capacity when full, though none would receive that much. The daily water ration had been set at 1 gallon per man for all purposes: drinking, cooking, washing, and the maintenance of personal hygiene in a climate where daytime temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winnett reached the front of the queue and extended his can to the quartermaster sergeant controlling the tap. The water that flowed out was brownish, carried the distinct taste of petroleum from containers that had previously held fuel, and was nonetheless the most valuable substance in Tobruk. Without it, the garrison would collapse faster than any German assault could achieve. Winnett carried his ration back to his position, calculating how to divide 1 gallon across the next 24 hours in the Libyan desert. The daily routine of siege life followed patterns established within the first weeks and then repeated with mind-numbing consistency for 8 months. Soldiers woke before dawn, collected water rations, consumed a breakfast of tea and biscuits or tinned meat if available, then moved to fighting positions, before full daylight made movement visible to German observers. Daylight hours were spent in covered positions or underground. The Luftwaffe appeared overhead with depressing regularity, and movement on the surface drew immediate artillery fire. Maintenance work, patrol preparations, and anything requiring exposure happened during darkness. The garrison existed on a reversed schedule where night became the active period, and daylight meant going to ground like nocturnal animals. The sun was as much an enemy as the Germans surrounding the perimeter, and soldiers learned to structure their existence around avoiding both. Nurse Margaret Gibson worked in the underground hospital carved into the limestone beneath Tobruk, a facility that had been expanded from the original Italian construction to handle the steady flow of casualties arriving daily. Gibson was one of approximately 40 nurses serving with the garrison, women who had volunteered for service in North Africa, and now found themselves in one of the most dangerous locations in the theater. The underground hospital could accommodate roughly 300 patients in its various wards and surgical theaters, all operating under electric lighting, powered by generators that consumed fuel almost as precious as water. Gibson's shifts ran 12 hours or longer when casualties arrived in quantity. She treated wounds from artillery fragments, crushing injuries from collapsed dugouts, and an ever-growing number of dysentery cases that would eventually overwhelm the medical capacity to respond effectively. The Luftwaffe bombing campaign against Tobruk maintained an intensity that varied based on German strategic priorities elsewhere, but never ceased entirely. During May and early June, German aircraft flew an average of 80 sorties per day over the fortress, or dropping bombs ranging from 50 kilograms to 500 kilograms, depending on aircraft type and target. The sound became a constant background to daily existence. The warning of approaching engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the crump of explosions, and then silence before the cycle repeated. Soldiers learned to estimate where bombs would land by the pitch of the whistle, a skill that had no training manual but came from experience and the strong motivation to not be in the wrong place when high explosive arrived. The bombing killed relatively few soldiers who remained in protected positions, but it destroyed equipment, disrupted sleep, frayed nerves, and created a constant psychological pressure that accumulated over weeks and months. That Supply Officer Captain Morris Spud Murphy maintained inventory records that revealed the garrison's situation with mathematical precision. On June 12th, Murphy's ledgers showed 11 days of ammunition remaining at current expenditure rates, 19 days of food, and water production that barely matched minimum consumption. The supplies existed as physical stockpiles scattered in dumps across the perimeter, each dump camouflaged and dispersed to prevent single air attacks from destroying critical resources. Murphy spent his days calculating consumption rates, projecting when stocks would reach critical levels, and submitting requests to Cairo for resupply runs. The destroyers that braved the nighttime dash to Tobruk could carry approximately 50 tons of cargo per vessel, enough to keep the garrison functioning for perhaps 3 days. Murphy's calculations were constantly racing against time, and the mathematics allowed no margin for error. The dust storms that swept across Tobruk averaged 2 to 3 per week during summer months, transforming the environment with terrifying speed. Winds would rise from relative calm to 50 miles per hour in minutes, lifting fine desert sand to heights of several thousand feet, and reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. During storms, military operations essentially ceased. Aircraft couldn't fly. Artillery couldn't observe targets. Patrols couldn't navigate. The dust penetrated every seal, every cover, every piece of equipment not hermetically closed. And soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces and breathed through improvised filters, but the dust still coated tongues, irritated eyes, and worked its way into ears and nostrils. Weapons required immediate cleaning after storms to prevent the fine particles from jamming mechanisms. The storms were miserable, dangerous, and offered one small benefit. During dust storms, both sides were equally blind, and the fighting stopped. Dysentery became the silent killer that ultimately threatened the garrison more seriously than German attacks. By June, medical officers estimated that 35% of the garrison showed symptoms of bacterial dysentery, contracted from contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, or the clouds of flies that bred in the waste that accumulated faster than burial parties could manage. The disease manifested as debilitating diarrhea, dehydration, abdominal cramping, and progressive weakness that rendered soldiers incapable of fighting effectively, even if they remained technically fit for duty. Treatment options were limited: isolation of infected cases when possible, rehydration with the scarce water supplies, and time for immune systems to fight off infection. Severe cases required hospitalization, consuming bed space needed for combat casualties. The medical staff could treat symptoms, but could not eliminate the underlying causes of infection that pervaded every aspect of life in Tobruk. The Royal Navy destroyer runs that sustained the garrison were operations of extraordinary risk, executed with routine regularity. Between April and October 1941, destroyers made 47 successful supply voyages to Tobruk, delivering critical cargo during brief windows of darkness, while under constant threat from German aircraft, Italian naval forces, and the ever-present danger of mines. 7 destroyers were damaged seriously enough to require extended repairs during this period. The runs followed predictable patterns because the sea offered only one safe approach route. Ships departed Alexandria in the late afternoon, made the 340-mile voyage at maximum speed, arrived at Tobruk around 0200 hours, unloaded cargo in approximately 45 minutes, then raced back toward Alexandria, hoping to reach air cover before daylight brought Luftwaffe attacks. The sailors who executed these missions understood the mathematics. Each run risked a ship worth millions of pounds to deliver 50 tons of supplies. They ran the missions anyway, because without those supplies, Tobruk would fall. Evening mail call represented the highlight of most soldiers' day, the moment when connection to home became tangible through letters that had traveled 6,000 miles in 6 weeks to reach the Libyan desert. Men gathered around company headquarters as sergeants distributed envelopes, calling out names in alphabetical order, while soldiers waited with the particular tension of hoping to hear their own name. Letters from Australia bore postmarks from February and March, describing events that had occurred before Easter, before the siege began, before the world had heard of Tobruk. Soldiers read about family gatherings, mundane workplace dramas, complaints about rationing, and news of friends enlisting or being posted overseas. The disconnect between the ordinary civilian world described in letters and the extraordinary circumstances of siege warfare created a strange cognitive dissonance. Home felt both painfully close through the words on paper and impossibly distant across the months of mail delay. The siege was entering its 3rd month by mid-June, and the initial assumption that relief would come quickly was fading into the recognition that this would last far longer than anyone had anticipated. Soldiers adapted because humans are remarkably adaptable when given no alternative. They learned to function on 1 gallon of water per day. They learned to sleep through artillery bombardments. They learned to identify aircraft by sound alone and to judge bomb trajectories by whistle pitch. Oh, they learned which Italian rations were edible and which were best avoided regardless of hunger. They learned to live underground like the rats they had named themselves, emerging at night to fight and resupply, then disappearing again when the sun rose. The learning curve was steep, and those who failed to adapt became casualties or broke under the psychological strain. Those who succeeded became something harder than they had been when they arrived, veterans of a siege that had no end in sight and no certainty of relief. The longest days stretched ahead, and survival required endurance measured in months rather than weeks. May 15th, 1941. The Italian freighter Leverkusen wallowed through moderate seas 80 miles north of Benghazi, all carrying 3,500 tons of fuel in drums and jerry cans desperately needed by Rommel's forces besieging Tobruk. The cargo represented approximately 10 days of operations for the Africa Corps at current consumption rates. The ship traveled in convoy with 2 other freighters and an escort of 3 Italian destroyers, following the coastal route from Tripoli to Benghazi, where cargo would be unloaded and trucked forward to German positions. At 1400 hours, the convoy's sonar operators detected a submarine contact. Before defensive maneuvers could begin, torpedoes from His Majesty's submarine upholder struck Leverkusen amidships. The freighter broke in half and sank in less than 8 minutes. 3,500 tons of fuel settled to the sea floor, on taking with it Rommel's plans for renewed assault on Tobruk's perimeter. The torpedo that sank Leverkusen was far more effective than any artillery barrage. The mathematics of Axis supply in North Africa were brutal and unforgiving from the beginning. Rommel's forces required approximately 2,500 tons of supplies daily to maintain operations: fuel for vehicles and aircraft, ammunition for all weapon systems, food for German and Italian troops, water in a theater where natural sources were scarce, spare parts for equipment operating under punishing desert conditions, and medical supplies for an army fighting far from home. The actual delivery averaged 1,400 tons per day when conditions were favorable, and far less when Royal Navy and Royal Air Force interdiction intensified. Every ton of supplies had to cross the Mediterranean from Italian ports, survive the voyage despite Allied submarines and aircraft, reach North African harbors like Tripoli or Benghazi, then travel by road across hundreds of miles of desert where fuel consumed in transport reduced the amount available for combat operations. Staff officers calculated that transporting supplies from Tripoli to Tobruk consumed approximately 35% of fuel cargo in the vehicles doing the transporting. The supply system was consuming itself. Rommel held a staff meeting on May 23rd to review the logistics situation, and the intelligence summaries presented that day painted a grim picture. Fuel stocks sufficient for 1 major offensive operation, or approximately 3 weeks of current defensive operations. Ammunition adequate for sustained combat, but insufficient for the artillery preparation necessary to reduce Tobruk's fortifications. Food supplies reasonable, but dependent on continued Italian convoy operations. Water production barely meeting requirements. Vehicle spare parts critically low, with tank recovery and repair limited by lack of replacement tracks, engines, and transmissions. The staff officers present offered various solutions. Request additional shipping from Italy. Reduce operational tempo to conserve resources. Prioritize supply delivery for specific weapon systems. Rommel listened, then made the decision that would define the next several months. Tobruk had to fall before supply constraints made offensive operations impossible. Every day of delay strengthened the defenders and weakened German capability to overcome them. British intelligence achieved a decisive advantage in the supply war through signals, intercepts decoded at Bletchley Park. The Ultra program had broken German Enigma codes and Italian naval codes, providing Allied commanders with access to Axis communications, often within hours of transmission. When Italian naval headquarters radioed convoy schedules, cargo manifests, and routing instructions to escorts, British codebreakers read the same messages. When Rommel reported fuel status to Berlin, British intelligence knew his supply state before his own logistics officers completed their inventories. The intelligence allowed precise targeting. Royal Navy submarines could position themselves along convoy routes with foreknowledge of timing and composition. RAF bombers could strike convoys at the most vulnerable points. An overall Allied strategy could exploit German supply weaknesses with confidence based on actual data rather than estimates. June 8th provided a textbook example of how ultra-intelligence shaped operations. British codebreakers intercepted and decoded Italian naval messages describing a convoy scheduled to depart Taranto on June 6th, carrying ammunition and fuel to Benghazi, with arrival planned for June 10th. The manifest listed exact cargo: 4,000 tons of ammunition, 1,500 tons of fuel, machinery, and spare parts. RAF headquarters, Malta, received the intelligence and dispatched Bristol Blenheim bombers to intercept. The aircraft found the convoy exactly where intelligence predicted, exactly when predicted, and sank 2 of 3 freighters in the convoy. That's 5,500 tons of supplies went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Rommel's ammunition stocks, already low, would not be replenished. His planned attack on the Tobruk salient, scheduled for mid-June, was postponed indefinitely. A successful code-breaking operation had canceled a military offensive without the British ground forces even being aware of what had been prevented. The Italian Navy paid an enormous price attempting to maintain supply convoys against this level of Allied interdiction. Between May and August 1941, Italian losses included 12 destroyers and 4 cruisers sunk or damaged beyond repair while escorting convoys or attempting to counter British naval operations in the central Mediterranean. The Italian Navy entered the war with a modern fleet built around fast battleships and heavy cruisers. But the cumulative attrition was unsustainable. Each ship lost represented years of construction effort and highly trained crews that could not be quickly replaced. German demands for increased convoy protection conflicted with Italian concerns about preserving fleet strength for potential major engagements. The tension between these strategic priorities meant convoys often sailed with inadequate escort, making them even more vulnerable to British submarines and aircraft. Rommel's quartermasters resorted to increasingly desperate measures to stretch inadequate supplies. German maintenance crews stripped fuel from knocked-out tanks, filtering the salvage gasoline to remove debris and mixing it with captured British petrol, regardless of whether the mixture met engine specifications. Italian rations were distributed to German troops despite complaints about quality. Ammunition was rationed by headquarters order. Artillery batteries received daily shell allocations they could not exceed without specific approval. Water discipline became obsessive, with usage tracked and violators punished. Vehicle movement was minimized to conserve fuel, which meant reconnaissance suffered, and intelligence about British dispositions declined in quality. The Siege of Tobruk had become a siege of Rommel's own logistics, and the attackers were being slowly strangled by mathematics beyond their control. By late summer, the percentage of Axis supplies lost to Allied interdiction had climbed to 28% of all cargo dispatched from Italian ports. More than 1 in 4 tons of supplies intended for North Africa never arrived, sent to the Mediterranean floor by torpedoes or bombs. The supplies that did arrive then faced the overland journey across 900 miles of desert from Tripoli to Tobruk, with fuel consumption, breakdown, and occasional British commando raids further reducing what reached the front. Staff officers calculated that of every 100 tons of fuel loaded in Tripoli, approximately 45 tons reached German combat units at Tobruk. The remainder was lost in transit, consumed in transportation, or siphoned off for administrative and support functions. No army could sustain offensive operations under such constraints, and Rommel's dream of taking Tobruk by storm was drowning in the cold arithmetic of supply ratios. A German intelligence eventually recognized that British forces possessed unusually accurate information about Axis convoy schedules and supply states, but they never fully understood the source. Some officers suspected Italian security leaks, others blamed signals discipline failures, and a few wondered about code compromise without being able to prove it. The Enigma cipher was considered unbreakable by German cryptographic experts, a confidence that would prove catastrophically misplaced throughout the war. The ultra-secret remained protected, and British forces continued reading Axis communications with an intelligence advantage that shaped every aspect of the North African campaign. Rommel was fighting with his supply lines exposed, his logistics vulnerabilities known to the enemy, and his operational planning compromised before execution. The Siege of Tobruk could not succeed under these conditions, but Rommel either did not understand or would not accept the implications. The supply war was invisible to soldiers in the trenches on both sides, yet it determined the siege's outcome more surely than any tactical engagement. German attacks failed not only because Australian defenders fought effectively, but because Rommel never had sufficient ammunition, fuel, or supplies to sustain the kind of methodical reduction that might have succeeded. British defenders held not only because of courage and tactical skill, but because the Royal Navy maintained supply lines, despite horrific losses, and ultra-intelligence allowed precise interdiction of Axis logistics. The siege became a race between Rommel's dwindling resources and British ability to maintain the defenders. By midsummer 1941, the mathematics favored the defenders, though months of fighting remained before that mathematical reality would translate into operational success. The torpedoes, bombs, and intelligence summaries had already won the siege. The soldiers still had to endure it. June 29, 1941, 0200 hours. His Majesty's Australian ship Waterhen approached Tobruk Harbor on her 39th supply run since the siege began, her decks loaded with ammunition and her hull riding low in calm Mediterranean waters. Commander Horace Burgess stood on the bridge, watching searchlights from shore stations sweep the darkness in prearranged patterns that guided destroyers through the minefield gap and into the harbor. The ship carried 50 tons of artillery shells and small arms ammunition, cargo that represented perhaps 3 days of defensive fire for the garrison. Waterhen's engineering crew had pushed the ship's engines beyond rated specifications for weeks, maintaining the 30-knot speed necessary to complete the round trip from Alexandria in darkness. The engines were overdue for overhaul. The hull needed yard time. The crew had been running supply missions for 3 months without rest. But Tobruk needed ammunition, and Waterhen would deliver it because stopping meant letting the garrison down. The supply run procedure had been refined through experience and losses until it achieved routine efficiency despite extraordinary danger. Destroyers departed Alexandria in late afternoon, following courses that kept them within range of RAF fighter cover for as long as possible before turning toward Tobruk after dark. The 340-mile passage required approximately 11 hours at maximum speed, timing arrival at Tobruk for the darkest hours between midnight and 0400. Ships approached through a swept channel in the defensive minefield, guided by shore lights visible only from specific approach vectors that changed nightly to prevent German aircraft from exploiting the pattern. Unloading began the instant ships reached dock. Soldiers formed human chains from holds to shore, or passing ammunition boxes and supply crates hand to hand, while ship's crews worked winches and cargo nets. The entire operation had to complete within 45 minutes to allow destroyers to clear the harbor and reach open water before dawn brought Luftwaffe attacks. The human chain method proved faster than mechanical cargo handling for the small loads destroyers could carry. Soldiers stationed at Tobruk understood that every minute saved during unloading was another minute the ship had to reach safety before daylight. They worked with desperate intensity, muscles burning, hands bleeding from sharp metal edges on ammunition crates, passing tons of cargo from ship to shore in the allocated time. Officers monitored stopwatches, calling out elapsed time at 5-minute intervals. When 30 minutes had passed, that warnings became urgent. Ships needed time to cast off, clear the harbor, and build speed before the eastern sky began lightening. At 45 minutes, whether unloading was complete or not, ships prepared to depart. Cargo left aboard would return to Alexandria. Missing the departure window risked the ship, the crew, and all future supply runs they might execute. Waterhen completed unloading on schedule that morning, cast off at 02:45 hours, and turned toward the open sea. Commander Burgess ordered maximum speed, and the destroyer worked up to 31 knots, hull vibrating from the strain on aging engines. Dawn came at 05:15. By 05:30, Waterhen was 30 miles from Tobruk, racing toward the relative safety of waters covered by RAF fighters based in Egypt. At 0600 hours, Italian CR-42 fighters from bases in Libya spotted the destroyer and commenced attack runs. The aircraft carried small bombs and machine guns, inadequate to sink a warship under normal circumstances, but Waterhen was neither modern nor lucky. Near misses damaged hull plates already weakened by months of hard service. Engine room flooding began at 06:15. Speed dropped to 20 knots, then 15, then 10. Burgess ordered abandon ship at 06:45. The crew took to life rafts, and Waterhen rolled over and sank at 07:20 hours on June 29, 1941. She had completed 39 supply runs. Tobruk needed a 40th, and there would be no ship available to make it. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean fleet from Alexandria, all faced calculations that had no good solutions. Every destroyer committed to Tobruk supply runs was a destroyer unavailable for convoy escort, fleet screening, or the 100 other tasks that strained naval resources in the Mediterranean theater. The fleet had started the war with insufficient destroyers for the missions assigned, and losses had been severe. Sinking Waterhen was the 27th destroyer sunk or damaged beyond economical repair since April, from a total force that had numbered approximately 60 destroyers at the campaign's start. Cunningham's staff officers presented options: reduce Tobruk supply runs, prioritize cargo types, accept longer intervals between deliveries. Each option meant the garrison would receive less, and less meant the defenders would be weaker when the next German assault came. Cunningham made a calculation that said more about naval culture than mathematical logic. One destroyer, he noted, roughly equaled keeping 2,000 men supplied for 1 month. Losing destroyers was terrible. Losing Tobruk would be worse. The cargo delivered by these supply runs totaled 72,000 tons between April and December 1941, an average of approximately 8,000 tons per month, delivered in increments of 50 tons per voyage. The supplies included artillery ammunition that consumed the most shipping weight, small arms ammunition that came in smaller loads but higher volume, food concentrates that packed efficiently, water when local production failed to meet demand, medical supplies including morphine and antiseptics and surgical equipment, a fuel for generators and vehicles, though water transport of petrol was avoided when possible due to fire risk, and the intangible cargo of mail that weighed almost nothing but mattered enormously to morale. The destroyers also transported personnel, fresh troops rotating in to replace casualties or exhausted units, specialists needed for particular tasks, and wounded evacuated for treatment in Egyptian hospitals. Over the siege's duration, 34,000 men rotated through Tobruk aboard these destroyers, moving in both directions as relief operations slowly replaced the original garrison. The nickname Spud Run originated during the first successful resupply mission in early April, when HMS Voyager delivered 40 tons of potatoes as part of her cargo. The potatoes were desperately needed. The garrison was subsisting on preserved rations that provided calories but little fresh food, and vitamin deficiencies were appearing among troops who had been in theater for months. Soldiers unloading the ship were surprised and delighted to see crates of fresh vegetables rather than just ammunition and fuel. Someone remarked that the Navy had undertaken a Spud Run, and the name stuck. Subsequent supply missions were called Spud Runs regardless of cargo, the term capturing both the mundane necessity of feeding the garrison and the dark humor that British Commonwealth troops used to cope with danger that had become routine. The destroyers making these runs faced mines, submarines, aircraft, and mechanical breakdown with every voyage, but soldiers called them Spud Runs, and the Navy kept sailing them. And the cost in ships exceeded anything sustainable for a conventional operation. 27 destroyers sunk or damaged beyond repair represented roughly 45% of the destroyer force committed to Mediterranean operations. Additionally, 4 cruisers were lost supporting operations around Tobruk or covering destroyer supply runs. The financial cost in 1941, sterling ran to tens of millions of pounds. Each destroyer cost approximately £2 million to build, each cruiser substantially more, and the investment lost in sunken vessels could not be quickly replaced. British shipyards were building replacements, but construction took years and the need existed now. Every ship lost to Tobruk was a ship unavailable for the Atlantic convoys that kept Britain itself alive, or a ship missing from Pacific deployments after Japan entered the war, a ship subtracted from escort groups protecting troop transports worldwide. The naval commitment to Tobruk represented a strategic gamble that victory in North Africa justified these sacrifices. The sailors executing the supply runs developed their own culture and traditions around what had become a deadly routine. Crews painted unofficial tallies on their ships' funnels, one mark for each successful Tobruk run completed. Ships competed informally to see which could achieve the most runs, with crews taking pride in their vessel's endurance and their own ability to keep pushing worn-out machinery past its limits. The destroyer, HMS Nizam, an Australian ship, completed over 40 runs before being damaged in October. Her crew painted 40 small rat insignias on the funnel, one for each run, adopting the Rats of Tobruk identity for themselves. When Nizam finally reached Alexandria for long-delayed repairs, the engineering officer reported that the ship's engines were operating at 75% efficiency. Metal fatigue was visible throughout the hull, and continuing operations would likely result in catastrophic mechanical failure. The ship sailed 3 more runs before being forcibly pulled from the rotation. The Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force mounted continuous efforts to interdict the supply runs, but night operations presented challenges that 1941 aviation technology struggled to overcome. Aircraft attempting to locate and attack fast-moving destroyers in darkness had to rely on visual sighting, which required illumination from flares that gave away the attackers' positions. German night fighters had limited success, and their operations risked collision with their own aircraft in the congested airspace over Tobruk. Daytime attacks were more successful, which explained why destroyers raced to clear the area before dawn. The wreck of Waterhen demonstrated what happened when timing failed, and ships remained within range of shore-based aircraft after sunrise. The lesson was relearned with each loss, and departure schedules were adjusted to add safety margins, even though that meant reducing cargo capacity to ensure ships could make speed. By late autumn, the supply situation had reached a kind of grim equilibrium. The Navy had lost ships it could not afford to lose, but had sustained the garrison long enough for larger strategic developments to matter. Tobruk had held through the critical summer months when German assault seemed most likely to succeed. The garrison had been resupplied, if barely. Casualties had been evacuated, though many waited weeks for space aboard outbound destroyers. The mathematics remained terrible. Trading destroyers worth millions of pounds to deliver 50-ton cargo loads defied every principle of efficient logistics. But efficiency was not the point. Tobruk held because the Royal Navy kept sailing the runs, accepting losses that would have terminated any peacetime operation, and maintaining a sea bridge across 340 miles of contested waters. The Spud Runs had become one of the essential threads holding together Allied strategy in North Africa. The thread held because sailors kept sailing, despite knowing their odds decreased with every voyage. The Navy's secret war was not secret at all to the men who fought it, and they fought it with the stubborn professionalism that had always characterized British naval culture. The ships kept sailing because Tobruk kept fighting, and Tobruk kept fighting because the ships kept sailing. August 2nd, 1941. The water pumped from well number 3 emerged rust-colored into the collection tank, carrying the unmistakable taste of petroleum mixed with salt. Corporal James MacDonald, supervising the well operation that morning, immediately shut down the pump and ordered samples sent to medical officers for testing. The well had produced clean water, clean by desert standards, meaning brackish but drinkable, for 4 months since the siege began. Now something had changed deep underground, where limestone aquifers held the water that kept 36,000 men alive. MacDonald had been a well driller in civilian life before enlisting, and he understood what rust-colored water probably meant. The aquifer was being contaminated either by seawater infiltration from the Mediterranean less than 2 miles away, or by petroleum products leaking from fuel storage tanks or destroyed vehicles. Either way, well number 3 had just subtracted several thousand gallons per day from Tobruk's already inadequate water production. The mathematics were becoming impossible. Dr. Alan Walker received the water sample in his medical facility at 0900 hours and began testing immediately. The procedures were simple but time-consuming, measuring bacterial counts through microscope examination of cultured samples, testing pH levels, checking for chemical contamination through reagent reactions. The results came back over the following hours, each test confirming what Walker had suspected from the water's appearance. E. coli bacterial count measured 400 times the acceptable level for human consumption. Petroleum hydrocarbon contamination exceeded safe limits by factors that made the water actively poisonous if consumed in quantity. Salt content indicated seawater was indeed infiltrating the aquifer, likely driven by overpumping that had lowered water table levels below sea level and created pressure differentials that pulled Mediterranean water through porous limestone. Well number 3 would have to be taken offline indefinitely, possibly permanently. Walker compiled his findings into a report that reached General Moorehead's headquarters by afternoon. The water crisis that medical officers had warned about for weeks had arrived. The engineering assessment of Tobruk's water system revealed problems that had no easy solutions. The fortress relied on 7 primary wells drilled to depths ranging from 80 to 140 feet, supplemented by ancient Roman cisterns that contributed minimal amounts to overall supply. In peacetime or under normal garrison conditions, the system produced approximately 40,000 gallons daily, adequate for the Italian peacetime garrison of perhaps 10,000 men who had access to desalination plants and regular water shipments. A wartime garrison of 36,000 men required at a minimum 40,000 gallons just for drinking and cooking, leaving nothing for bathing, laundry, vehicle maintenance, generator cooling systems, or the medical facilities that needed clean water for surgical operations and wound treatment. The system had been operating at maximum capacity since April. Now 4 of the 7 wells were showing signs of contamination from saltwater, petroleum, or bacterial sources. Production capacity had dropped to approximately 28,000 gallons per day. The shortage was approaching critical levels. Hospital admissions graphed the human cost of inadequate water and sanitation in brutal clarity. The curve began rising in June when dysentery cases first appeared in numbers large enough to overwhelm normal sick call procedures. By July, medical officers recorded 150 new dysentery cases per week. By early August, the rate had climbed to over 250 cases per week. The disease spread through fecal-oral transmission, flourishing in conditions where water was rationed for washing, where flies bred in uncovered latrines that could not be properly maintained with available resources, and where men lived in close quarters that made isolation of infected individuals nearly impossible. Bacterial dysentery caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, abdominal cramping, and fever. Soldiers lost weight rapidly, 15 to 20 pounds over the course of a week in severe cases. The dehydration worsened because the water needed for recovery was the same water being rationed for survival. At least the engineering response to the contamination involved desperate measures attempted under combat conditions. Teams of engineers worked to decontaminate wells by pumping them empty and attempting to flush contaminated water from surrounding aquifer rock, a procedure that consumed water to purify water, a paradox that made the effort nearly futile. Other teams attempted to seal petroleum leaks from underground fuel storage tanks, working in cramped spaces while German artillery sporadically targeted the area. The Roman cisterns were excavated and cleaned, yielding modest increases in capacity, but nowhere near enough to offset the loss of contaminated wells. Reverse osmosis or desalination technology that might have converted seawater to drinking water existed in theory, but not in any form that could be deployed to Tobruk in 1941. The garrison was dependent on groundwater that was failing, and engineering could slow the failure but not prevent it. Medical treatment for dysentery focused on managing symptoms, because antibiotics effective against bacterial infection would not be widely available until later in the war. Doctors administered fluids to counter dehydration when water could be spared for medical use, prescribed rest that soldiers could not take while remaining on duty, and isolated severe cases to prevent transmission when isolation facilities existed. The treatment options were inadequate, and medical officers knew it. They watched men deteriorate, and recorded the progression of disease through wards that lacked the resources to properly treat what should have been a manageable illness, and wrote reports warning that the garrison's combat effectiveness was eroding from causes invisible to the enemy besieging the perimeter. A soldier weakened by dysentery could still man a defensive position, but his effectiveness declined with his physical condition. Units with 50% dysentery rates were units at half strength regardless of nominal roster numbers. The statistics from August revealed a crisis approaching the point where military operations would become unsustainable. 42% of the garrison had been hospitalized for dysentery or related gastrointestinal diseases at some point during August. The average weight loss among soldiers serving in Tobruk exceeded 18 pounds from their arrival weight, measured at weigh-ins conducted for medical monitoring. Soldiers photographed in August showed visible physical deterioration compared to photographs from April. Faces gaunt, bodies skeletal, eyes with the sunken appearance that indicated chronic dehydration. The garrison was literally wasting away despite receiving adequate calories from rations. The human body requires water to process food, maintain temperature regulation, and function at basic levels. Without adequate water, food calories cannot prevent deterioration. Tobruk's defenders were starving for water. While surrounded by an ocean, they could not drink. Emergency water shipments by destroyer became part of supply run cargo starting in late August. Danish ships carried 50-ton loads that now included water drums, taking space previously allocated to ammunition or food. 50 tons of water equaled approximately 11,000 gallons, roughly 1/4 of the garrison's daily requirement, delivered every 3 to 4 days when supply runs could be executed. The water arrived in steel drums that had previously held fuel or other petroleum products, contaminating the water with the same substances the garrison was trying to avoid from wells. Soldiers learned to let water sit in the drums for 24 hours, allowing petroleum to separate and float to the surface where it could be carefully decanted off. The remaining water tasted of gasoline, but was safer than severely contaminated well water. This was the state of Tobruk's water supply in late summer 1941. Emergency shipments of fuel-contaminated water consumed after careful preparation to reduce toxicity. Typhoid fever represented an additional threat that required aggressive vaccination programs to prevent outbreak. Typhoid spreads through contaminated water and food, thriving in exactly the conditions present throughout Tobruk. Medical officers initiated a mandatory vaccination program in June, administering typhoid vaccine doses to every soldier in the garrison. The vaccine required 2 shots separated by several weeks, with booster shots every 6 weeks after that to maintain immunity. 28,000 vaccine doses were administered between June and September, using medical supplies brought in on destroyer supply runs at the cost of other cargo. The vaccination program prevented the typhoid outbreak that would almost certainly have occurred otherwise, but it consumed resources desperately needed for other purposes and required medical personnel to focus on preventive care rather than treating the dysentery cases' overwhelming hospital capacity. The meeting on August 15th brought together General Morshead, his chief medical officer, the garrison engineer, and senior supply officers to review the situation and explore options. The medical officer presented the data: 42% hospitalization rate, water production declining, contamination worsening, and no engineering solution capable of reversing the trend. The engineer confirmed that wells could not be adequately decontaminated with available resources, and that seawater infiltration would continue as long as overpumping lowered the water table below sea level. The supply officer reported that destroyer capacity for water shipment was limited, and that every ton of water carried meant one less ton of ammunition or food. Morshead listened to the assessments, reviewed the numbers, and reached a conclusion that would eventually drive strategic decisions at higher command levels. The water situation was, in the engineer's phrasing, unsustainable past September. Tobruk could not be held indefinitely under current conditions. The garrison would need to be relieved or evacuated before the water supply failed completely, and the defense collapsed from disease rather than German assault. The water crisis of August 1941 ultimately shaped the siege's outcome as much as any tactical engagement. The German attacks had failed to break the perimeter through force. The supply strangulation could not starve the garrison quickly enough. But the water contamination and resulting dysentery epidemic threatened to accomplish what Rommel's panzers could not, forcing the abandonment of Tobruk through the simple mathematics of human biology. The fortress could be held only as long as soldiers could physically hold it, and soldiers dying from dysentery could not hold anything. The siege had become a race between Allied plans to relieve the garrison and the failing water system that was killing defenders from within. The outcome would determine whether Tobruk remained in Allied hands or whether the fortress that had resisted every German assault would fall not to superior tactics but to contaminated water. The next chapter would be written not in combat reports but in medical statistics, and those statistics were telling a story of impending collapse. August 20th, 1941. A telegram arrived at General Claude Auchinlec's headquarters in Cairo, transmitted from London with Prime Minister Winston Churchill's personal cipher signature. The message was characteristically blunt. The Australians must be relieved. Churchill had been receiving reports from Australian Prime Minister John Curtin, expressing concern about the 9th Division's prolonged siege in Tobruk, casualties mounting from disease and combat, and the political pressure building in Australia as families received letters describing conditions their sons and husbands endured in the Libyan desert. The telegram represented more than military necessity. It reflected the complex politics of coalition warfare, where Dominion governments maintained sovereignty over their forces and could demand changes in deployment that British commanders had to accommodate. Auchinlech read the directive, understood its implications, and began planning an operation that would require months to execute and risked undermining the very defense that had made Tobruk strategically valuable. The Australian political situation had evolved considerably since the 9th Division deployed to North Africa in early 1941. Prime Minister Robert Menzies, and who had supported full Australian commitment to the war in Europe and the Middle East, resigned in August and was replaced by John Curtin from the Labour Party. Curtin represented a different political tradition, less automatically deferential to British strategic priorities, more focused on Australian national interests, and more responsive to public opinion that was growing increasingly concerned about Australian casualties in distant theaters, while Japan expanded aggressively in the Pacific. Curtin received regular briefings on the Tobruk situation, including casualty figures, medical reports describing the dysentery epidemic, and intelligence assessments suggesting the siege might continue for months. He faced political pressure from opposition parties, from families of soldiers in Tobruk, And from newspapers questioning why Australian troops remained in an isolated fortress while British and Indian forces garrisoned safer positions in Egypt. The numbers Curtin reviewed told a sobering story. Between April and September, the Australian 9th Division had suffered 832 killed, 2,177 wounded, and an additional 3,000 hospitalized for disease, primarily dysentery and related gastrointestinal illnesses. These figures represented roughly 40% of the Australian force that had entered Tobruk in January and February. The division that emerged from relief would be substantially different from the formation that had entered the siege, depleted by casualties, weakened by disease, and psychologically marked by 8 months of continuous combat under siege conditions. Curtin made the decision that any responsible national leader would make. He requested the Australians be relieved and rotated to rear areas for rest and reconstitution. The request became a demand when initial British responses suggested delays might be necessary for operational reasons. British newspapers reacted to the Australian relief decision with commentary that ranged from understanding to barely concealed criticism. Some papers emphasized the Australian sacrifice and praised their performance during the siege's most critical months. Others suggested the relief represented a retreat while Tobruk still held, implying questions about Australian resolve that infuriated soldiers who had spent 8 months under conditions most of the journalists criticizing them had never experienced. The Times published an editorial on September 5th, noting that the defense of Tobruk has been a Commonwealth effort, and suggesting that British troops were equally capable of maintaining the siege. The editorial was technically correct, but politically tone-deaf, ignoring the reality that Australian troops had borne the brunt of the most intense fighting and suffered disproportionate casualties. The controversy simmered in British and Australian press for weeks, adding political complexity to what should have been a straightforward military rotation. As General Leslie Morshead learned of the relief decision on September 12th, when he received orders detailing the timeline and procedures for rotating his Australian units out of Tobruk. His reaction, recorded in contemporaneous accounts, mixed relief that his men would finally receive respite with concern about the operational risks involved in changing garrison composition during ongoing siege conditions. Morshead understood that his Australian troops knew the ground intimately after 5 months of continuous defense. They knew which sectors were most vulnerable, which positions required the most attention, where minefields had been laid, and what gaps existed, how German tactics had evolved, and the 100 details that made the difference between effective and ineffective defense. Replacing experienced defenders with fresh troops meant losing that accumulated knowledge and accepting performance degradation during the transition period. He read the relief orders to his brigade commanders, then added his own assessment. "We'll comply, but we'll do it properly so the next garrison has the best chance we can give them." The replacement forces began arriving in September, transported by the same destroyers that had sustained the siege since April. The British 70th Division would replace the bulk of the Australian 9th Division, supplemented by the Polish Carpathian Brigade that had served throughout the siege, and would remain. The relief operation required careful choreography. Australian units could not withdraw from their positions until British replacements arrived and were briefed on their new responsibilities. The briefing process consumed days as Australian officers walked British counterparts through defensive sectors, pointing out key terrain, explaining firing positions, reviewing response procedures for German attacks, and transferring the knowledge that existed primarily in memories rather than written documents. The British troops arriving were fresh but inexperienced in siege warfare. The Australians departing were exhausted but expert. The transition reduced overall defensive capability for weeks until the British troops gained equivalent experience. The destroyer evacuation began on September 19th and continued through October. Ships arriving with supplies and reinforcements departed, carrying Australian soldiers rotated out of the garrison. The process moved slowly because destroyer capacity limited each voyage to perhaps 300 troops, while maintaining space for wounded and urgent cargo. 68% of the original Australian garrison would eventually be relieved. Approximately 14,000 men rotated out over 6 weeks. The process was disrupted by German attacks, by weather that prevented destroyer operations, and by the simple mathematics of shipping capacity versus personnel numbers. Some Australian units remained in Tobruk until late November, serving alongside British replacements and becoming increasingly frustrated as relief dates were postponed repeatedly due to operational necessities. Polish forces that had served in Tobruk since April received no relief, and the contrast with Australian treatment created some tension. The Polish Carpathian Brigade numbered approximately 5,000 men who had reached the Middle East after extraordinary journeys through Soviet territory and Iran following Poland's partition. They had fought with distinction throughout the siege, suffered casualties proportional to their numbers, and endured the same conditions as their Australian comrades. But Poland had no government with the political leverage to demand relief, and the Polish troops remained in Tobruk when the Australians departed. Polish soldiers watching Australian units board destroyers for evacuation felt abandoned, though they understood the political realities that govern coalition warfare. The Polish brigade commander addressed his troops in early October, acknowledging the situation and emphasizing that they would continue the defense until Poland is free or we are dead. The speech reflected both Polish determination and the bitter recognition that their service would receive less consideration than troops from nations with functioning governments. General Auchinleck's planning staff in Cairo wrestled with the strategic implications of the relief operation. Tobruk's defense had become symbolically important beyond its military value. The fortress represented Allied ability to resist German advances, a bright spot in a war that had delivered mostly defeats across Europe and North Africa. Relieving the garrison risked creating the impression that the Allies were withdrawing, all potentially damaging morale throughout the theater. Yet, continuing to hold Tobruk with diseased and exhausted troops risked a collapse that would be far more damaging than managed withdrawal. The planning staff developed a narrative emphasizing that relief represented normal military rotation rather than retreat, that the defense would continue with fresh troops, and that the Australians had completed their mission successfully. Whether this narrative convinced anyone beyond the staff officers who wrote it remains questionable, but it became the official position. Churchill's original telegram demanding Australian relief had included a second element often overlooked in subsequent accounts: concern about what would happen to British prestige if Tobruk fell after Churchill had publicly emphasized its importance. The Prime Minister had told Parliament in May that Tobruk must be held, that its defense was vital to Allied strategy in the Mediterranean, and that the garrison's resistance demonstrated that German forces could be defeated. If Tobruk subsequently fell, particularly if it fell because Australian troops were withdrawn against British military advice, the political consequences would be severe, both domestically and internationally. Churchill's directive to relieve the Australians therefore came with the unspoken requirement that relief must not lead to Tobruk's loss. Auchinleck inherited the nearly impossible task of replacing a seasoned garrison with fresh troops while maintaining defensive effectiveness and preventing German forces from exploiting the transition period. The Australian troops boarding destroyers for evacuation carried mixed emotions. Relief at leaving a place where they had endured 8 months of bombardment, disease, and constant danger. Pride at having held Tobruk through the most critical period when German assault seemed most likely to succeed. Anger at what some perceived as abandonment of the mission before complete victory. Exhaustion so profound that some men fell asleep during the destroyer voyage and had to be physically wakened when ships reached Alexandria. The soldiers leaving Tobruk in September and October were different men than those who had arrived in January, harder, thinner, older in ways that had nothing to do with calendar time. They had become the rats of Tobruk, and that identity would follow them for the rest of their lives. But for now, they were simply soldiers going to the rear, leaving other soldiers to continue a fight that had no clear end in sight. The politics of relief revealed fundamental tensions in coalition warfare that would recur throughout the Second World War. Dominion governments maintained sovereignty over their forces and could withdraw them despite British strategic preferences. Political considerations shaped military decisions as much as tactical necessities. Public opinion in democratic nations imposed constraints that authoritarian regimes did not face. The relief of the Australians from Tobruk was militarily questionable but politically essential, operationally risky, but domestically necessary. It satisfied Australian public opinion while creating new vulnerabilities in the defense. It recognized the extraordinary service of the 9th Division while implicitly suggesting that British troops had not shouldered equivalent burdens. The decision was right and wrong simultaneously, depending on whether the question was judged by military or political criteria. War is politics by other means, and the politics of the siege were as complex as the military operations themselves. The Australians departed, the British arrived, and Tobruk remained under siege with no resolution closer than it had been in April when the siege began. November 21st, 1941, 0400 hours. German artillery opened fire across a front of approximately 2 miles, targeting the Western Salient where earlier assaults had partially penetrated the Tobruk perimeter. 450 guns concentrated their fire on British positions that had been held by Australian troops until 6 weeks prior. The barrage represented the largest artillery concentration Rommel had assembled since the siege began, ammunition expenditure that reflected both desperation and the recognition that this might be his final opportunity to take Tobruk by assault. The shells fell in systematic patterns designed to suppress defensive positions, cut wire obstacles, detonate minefields, and create pathways for the infantry and armor that would follow. The thunder of artillery rolled across the desert, audible in Tobruk harbor 6 miles away, where soldiers who had endured 8 months of bombardment recognized immediately that this was different. This was the assault everyone had been expecting, and it was targeting the same ground that had nearly broken in May. Captain Peter Vaux commanded a defensive position in the British 70th Division sector, occupying trenches that Australian troops had occupied until October. He had been in Tobruk for exactly 3 weeks, barely enough time to learn the ground and understand the defensive systems he now commanded. The artillery barrage walked toward his position with methodical precision, each salvo landing closer than the last. Vaux ordered his men into covered positions, deep dugouts with overhead protection where they could survive artillery fire and emerge when the barrage lifted to meet the inevitable infantry assault. The procedure was standard, learned through British Army training, and reinforced by briefings from Australian officers during the handover period. But training and briefings could not fully prepare soldiers for the reality of sustained artillery bombardment. The earth shook. Dust filled the air. The noise made communication impossible, except by prearranged signals. Men waited in darkness and hoped the overhead cover would hold. The German assault force that advanced when the artillery barrage lifted represented a significant portion of Rommel's remaining armor and mechanized infantry. The 21st Panzer Division provided the main striking force, approximately 5,000 infantry supported by 170 tanks. Mostly Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs with improved armor and armament compared to the vehicles used in April assaults. The objective remained the Western Salient, targeting the same posts S7 and S8, where German forces had achieved penetration in May. Rommel's plan called for breakthrough, exploitation toward the harbor, and the collapse of defensive coherence before British reserves could contain the penetration. The plan was essentially identical to earlier attempts, the difference being increased artillery preparation and concentration of force. Whether this would be sufficient remained to be seen, but Rommel was committed. Tobruk had to fall before Operation Crusader, the British offensive building in Egypt, forced him to choose between the siege and defending his rear areas. The advancing Panzer Mark IVs encountered the same fundamental problem that had stopped earlier assaults. The British had spent 6 months improving defenses while learning from previous German tactics. The minefield density in the salient had increased from 12 mines per 100 yards in April to 45 mines per 100 yards by November. The mines were not distributed evenly, but concentrated in killing zones where approaching tanks would be channeled into narrower frontages covered by anti-tank guns. The first German tanks entering the minefield triggered explosions that disabled tracks and running gear, immobilizing vehicles that became targets for British artillery. Following tanks attempted to find paths through the minefield, slowing their advance and bunching in patterns that made them vulnerable to concentrated fire. The German advantage in armor quality was being neutralized by British defensive engineering, and the mathematics increasingly favored the defenders. By 0830 hours, and German infantry had reached the old Post S7 position, advancing through the same ground where Australian and German soldiers had fought in May. The trenches still showed evidence of earlier combat, shell craters partially filled by drifting sand, fragments of equipment corroding in the sun, bloodstains faded but visible on concrete walls. German troops occupied these positions and attempted to consolidate for the next phase of the attack. British artillery, pre-registered on these exact coordinates from previous engagements, began dropping shells with accuracy that reflected months of preparation. The Germans had achieved tactical penetration, but at costs that were mounting rapidly. Casualty estimates from German after-action reports suggest approximately 300 killed and wounded in the first 4 hours of fighting, all numbers that would increase substantially as the day progressed. The Royal Air Force appeared overhead around mid-morning, Bristol Blenheim and Martin Maryland bombers attacking German concentrations that had been identified through aerial reconnaissance during the night. The bombing was not particularly accurate by later war standards, but accuracy mattered less when targeting dense formations of troops and vehicles occupying limited areas. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. German soldiers learned that the British could concentrate air power over Tobruk when needed, despite Luftwaffe claims of air superiority. The bombing disrupted German logistics as supply vehicles scattered to avoid attack, delaying the arrival of ammunition and fuel needed to sustain the assault. And each delay gave British defenders more time to reinforce threatened sectors, moving reserves into positions where they could counterattack if German forces achieved breakthrough. The maximum German penetration reached approximately 1,200 yards beyond the original perimeter, measured from the outer defenses to the deepest German positions identified by British observers. This represented less progress than the May assault had achieved, despite heavier artillery preparation and greater concentration of force. The difference reflected the improved British defenses and the accumulated experience that allowed commanders to respond more effectively to German tactics. British officers recognized the attack pattern from previous engagements: artillery barrage, armor assault, infantry following to consolidate. The defenders knew where to position anti-tank guns for optimal effect, how to time counterattacks to hit German forces during vulnerable consolidation phases, and when to call for artillery fire on pre-registered targets. The British 70th Division lacked the Australians' months of experience, but they had been well briefed, and the defensive systems had been thoroughly prepared. November 23rd brought the decision that ended the offensive. Rommel received intelligence reports indicating that Operation Crusader, the British 8th Army's relief offensive launched from Egypt on November 18th, had achieved significant penetrations west of Tobruk and was threatening to encircle his forces if he remained committed to the siege. He faced a strategic choice with no good options: continue the Tobruk assault and risk encirclement, or withdraw forces from Tobruk to defend against Crusader and abandon the siege that had consumed 8 months of effort and thousands of casualties. Rommel chose survival over obsession, though the choice clearly caused him anguish, judging from the tone of his orders to withdraw. German forces pulled back from their penetrations during the night of November 23rd, abandoning positions they had taken at such cost. The withdrawal was conducted professionally, with rear guards maintaining contact while main forces disengaged. By November 24th, the November offensive had ended in failure. British casualties in defending against the offensive totaled 624, killed and wounded across 48 hours of intense fighting, concentrated in a 2-mile sector. And German casualties went unrecorded in available sources with precision, but estimates based on captured documents and prisoner interrogations suggest approximately 800 to 1,000 killed and wounded, plus substantial vehicle losses. The casualty exchange ratio favored the defenders, as it had throughout the siege, reflecting the inherent advantages of prepared defensive positions against attacking forces crossing open ground under observed fire. The offensive had demonstrated that German tactical skill remained formidable, that armor could still achieve penetrations under favorable conditions, but also that the improved British defenses could contain those penetrations short of collapse. The November offensive represented Rommel's final serious attempt to take Tobruk during the 1941 siege. Both subsequent operations would shift to defensive postures as Operation Crusader developed, and German forces withdrew westward under British pressure. The siege that had begun in April with confident German predictions of quick victory was entering its 8th month, with no resolution in sight and British relief forces finally advancing. The offensive failed, not because of any single tactical error, but because the accumulated improvements in British defenses, the experience gained through 8 months of siege warfare, and the strategic pressure from Operation Crusader all combined to make success impossible. Rommel had never possessed sufficient resources to take Tobruk by assault, and by November, he no longer possessed even the inadequate resources he had started with in April. The siege was approaching its end, though the conclusion would come through British offensive action rather than German collapse. The killing ground of the Western Salient had claimed hundreds more casualties in pursuit of objectives that remained unachieved. The ground was thoroughly familiar to both sides now, soaked with blood from multiple engagements, and defended with a thoroughness that made further assault effectively impossible. Tobruk would hold. April 15, 1941. Corporal Bill Jenkins crawled through darkness toward the outer perimeter wire, carrying a canvas bag filled with British Mark II anti-tank mines. German positions were 400 yards ahead, invisible but known to be there from daytime observation. Jenkins was part of an engineer detachment tasked with expanding the minefield that formed Tobruk's first line of defense, working at night to avoid German artillery fire that made daytime mine-laying suicidal. Each mine weighed approximately 9 pounds and required careful placement to be effective, buried just deep enough to avoid detection, but shallow enough that tank weight would trigger the pressure fuse. Jenkins had laid approximately 200 mines over the past month, working in increments of 20 or 30 per night when conditions permitted. He calculated fields of fire in his head while placing each mine, visualizing how approaching tanks would move across this ground and where concentrated mine density would channel them into kill zones covered by anti-tank guns. The work was mathematical, invisible, and absolutely essential. The engineering effort that transformed Tobruk's defenses between April and December 1941 represented one of the siege's decisive factors, yet it remains less celebrated than the infantry battles that drew contemporary attention. Royal Engineers and Australian engineer units worked continuously to improve defensive systems that had been adequate when inherited from Italian construction, but needed substantial enhancement to resist sustained German assault. The improvements followed systematic patterns: minefield expansion and densification, anti-tank ditch deepening and widening, wire obstacle multiplication, overhead cover construction for defensive positions, water point protection, ammunition, dump hardening, and the creation of communication trenches that allowed movement between positions without surface exposure. And each improvement consumed materials, labor, and time, but each incrementally increased the cost that German forces would pay for any attempted breakthrough. The total number of mines laid by defenders between April and December reached approximately 62,000, distributed across 30 miles of perimeter with varying density based on terrain and vulnerability assessment. The mines included British Mark II anti-tank mines designed to destroy or disable armored vehicles, captured Italian B-2 mines that proved reasonably effective despite inferior design, and improvised devices that engineers created from unexploded German ordnance or fabricated using explosive charges and salvage components. The improvised mines included thermos bomb devices constructed from British thermite grenades modified with pressure fuses. Weapons that were unreliable but added to the general hazard of crossing the minefields. Mine density ranged from 12 mines per 100 yards in sectors judged less vulnerable to 45 or more mines per 100 yards in critical areas like the Western Salient, where German attacks concentrated. The anti-tank ditches that supplemented minefields represented enormous engineering effort conducted under combat conditions with inadequate equipment. The ditches were excavated to specifications of 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep, where soil conditions permitted, creating obstacles that could not be crossed by tanks without specialized bridging equipment that German forces rarely brought forward in quantity. 22 miles of anti-tank ditch had been excavated by December, or much of it representing expansion and improvement of original Italian ditches that had proven too narrow or shallow to stop determined assault. The excavation was done primarily by hand, using picks, shovels, and captured Italian equipment, conducted during darkness to avoid German observation. Some sections required blasting through limestone bedrock, consuming explosives that were in scarce supply, and creating noise that drew German artillery fire. Engineers learned to blast in sections, moving quickly after each explosion to avoid counter-battery fire that arrived within minutes. Wire obstacles evolved from simple barriers to complex defensive systems designed to channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones. The initial Italian wire consisted of single belts of barbed wire on wooden or steel pickets, inadequate against infantry but easily breached by engineers with cutting tools. British engineers expanded this into three-tier obstacles: outer warning wire designed to be visible and deter casual approach, middle resistance wire in dense belts requiring significant time to cut through, and inner protective wire immediately fronting defensive positions, where machine guns could engage anyone attempting to breach the final barrier. 400,000 yards of barbed wire were employed in these obstacles, wire that arrived on destroyer supply runs as cargo that seemed mundane compared to ammunition, but proved equally essential. The wire was strung at night by teams working in no man's land, vulnerable to German patrols and occasional artillery fire that killed or wounded engineers performing work that received little recognition. The discovery and reverse engineering of German teller mines provided British engineers with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and weaknesses. The teller mine was a circular anti-tank device containing approximately 11 pounds of TNT, designed with a pressure fuse that detonated when vehicles exceeded triggering weight. British engineers studying captured examples identified design features they could exploit. The mines were difficult to bury, flush in hard ground, creating surface disturbances visible from aerial reconnaissance, and the pressure fuse could sometimes be defeated by infantry walking carefully around edges rather than stepping on center plates. The intelligence was disseminated through training bulletins distributed to all units, marginally reducing the mines' effectiveness and giving British forces confidence that enemy devices could be understood and countered. The captured mines also provided templates for British mine production, though British designs followed different engineering principles. Engineers' casualties reflected the extraordinary danger of their work. 83 engineers were killed during the siege from various causes: mines they were laying that detonated prematurely, German artillery fire during construction operations, accidents with explosives, and combat casualties when engineers were pressed into infantry service during German assaults. The engineers represented approximately 3% of the total garrison strength, but accounted for 11% of total defensive casualties, bore a disproportionate rate that indicated how dangerous their specialized work had become. The men laying minefields knew that a single mistake, a dropped mine landing on its fuse, a faulty detonator, a miscalculation about safety distances, could kill them instantly. They worked anyway, because the alternative was leaving gaps in defenses that German tanks would exploit. Aerial photographs taken at monthly intervals throughout the siege documented the transformation of Tobruk's defenses in stark visual terms. April photographs showed the original Italian perimeter with relatively sparse minefields and limited wire obstacles. October photographs showed the same terrain covered with dense defensive works, minefields creating darker patterns in the sand from surface disturbances, anti-tank ditches appearing as dark lines where shadows fell into excavated areas, and wire obstacles visible as linear features crossed by communication trenches. The transformation was quantifiable. Minefield coverage increased from approximately 8,000 mines in April to 62,000 by December. Wire obstacle length increased from perhaps 100,000 yards to 400,000 yards. Anti-tank ditch length nearly tripled. The fortress that Rommel had attacked in April was substantially weaker than the fortress that defeated his November offensive, and engineering was the primary reason. The invisible mathematics of defensive geometry shaped engineering decisions throughout the siege. Engineers calculated fields of fire from defensive positions. Mapping zones where machine guns and anti-tank guns could engage targets effectively. They positioned obstacles to channel attacking forces into these killing zones, creating terrain where defenders enjoyed maximum advantage and attackers faced converging fire from multiple positions. The calculations involved trigonometry, ballistics, and detailed terrain analysis, work performed by officers and sergeants who understood that warfare was ultimately applied mathematics. A minefield positioned 50 yards forward or backward from optimal placement could mean the difference between stopping an assault and allowing breakthrough. An anti-tank ditch angled incorrectly could provide cover for attacking infantry rather than exposing them to defensive fire. The engineering decisions were invisible to casual observers, but determined tactical outcomes. Engineers' Cemetery in Tobruk held 83 marked graves by December, each representing an individual who had died improving defenses that would save hundreds of other soldiers' lives. The cemetery was located behind the main defensive line, protected from direct German observation, but subject to occasional artillery fire that made burial services brief and dangerous. Engineers buried their dead with minimal ceremony, marked the graves with improvised crosses or markers, and returned to work. The casualty rate they accepted as normal would have been considered catastrophic in peacetime construction work, but siege warfare made acceptable what would otherwise be unthinkable. And the engineers who survived would later describe their service with characteristic understatement, noting that they had laid some mines and dug some ditches. The description was accurate and profoundly inadequate for work that transformed Tobruk from vulnerable fortress to nearly impregnable defensive position. By December 1941, the engineering improvements had created a defensive system that could not be taken by assault with forces available to Rommel. The cost of attacking through 62,000 mines, crossing 22 miles of anti-tank ditches, breaching 400,000 yards of wire obstacles, and then assaulting prepared defensive positions held by experienced troops exceeded anything the Africa Corps could afford. The engineering had worked. The invisible war of calculations, mine placement, and ditch excavation and wire stringing had achieved what artillery barrages and infantry courage alone could not guarantee. The fortress would hold. The engineers had won their war through mathematics and midnight labor, and the victory was measured in attacks that never came because German commanders recognized the impossibility of success. The siege continued, but the threat of successful assault had ended. Engineering had made Tobruk invulnerable to anything except time and attrition, and time was now working against the besiegers rather than the defenders. October 15, 1941. The final battalion of Australian infantry, the 2nd 13th Battalion, formed up in darkness near the harbor, waiting for the destroyers that would carry them away from Tobruk after 8 months of siege. Private Jack Griffiths shouldered his equipment and looked back toward the perimeter he had helped defend since April, invisible now in the darkness, but mapped in his memory with the precision that came from months of living on terrain where every fold in the ground, every defensive position, every minefield gap mattered for survival. He was leaving, finally, after weeks of waiting, as relief operations were delayed by German attacks, by weather, by the simple constraints of destroyer capacity. Other Australian units had already departed. His battalion was among the last, handing over positions to British troops from the 70th Division who would continue the defense. Griffiths felt relief at leaving, mixed with something harder to define: guilt at abandoning the mission, concern for the soldiers who would replace them, and the strange possessiveness soldiers developed toward ground they have bled to hold. The relief operation that began on September 19th and continued through early December represented one of the most complex personnel movements conducted during the siege. 14,000 Australian soldiers needed to be evacuated, while simultaneously 14,000 British and reinforcement troops needed to be landed, all accomplished using destroyers with capacity of approximately 300 personnel per voyage while maintaining cargo space for supplies and ammunition. The mathematical challenge was formidable. At 300 troops per destroyer run, evacuating 14,000 Australians required approximately 47 voyages, assuming perfect efficiency with no weather delays, no German interference, and no mechanical problems. The actual number of voyages required exceeded 60 as delays accumulated, and operational constraints forced partial loads or canceled missions. The timeline stretched from 6 weeks to nearly 12 weeks, far longer than anyone had anticipated. The handover procedures between Australian units departing and British units arriving consumed enormous time and created vulnerabilities during the transition period. Australian officers conducted detailed briefings for their British counterparts, walking them through defensive sectors during darkness, pointing out key terrain features, explaining the placement of minefields and obstacles, reviewing procedures for responding to German attacks, and sharing the accumulated knowledge that came from months of continuous operations. The British officers arriving were professionally competent but lacked siege warfare experience. They asked questions that revealed gaps in understanding, questions about patrol routes, about communication procedures, about when to expect German artillery fire, and how to recognize the warning signs of an impending assault. The Australian officers answered patiently, knowing that their own lives might depend on how well these British troops performed if the relief operation was interrupted by German attack. November 10th brought the exact scenario everyone had feared. German offensive operations began while the relief was incomplete. Australian units still held portions of the perimeter alongside newly arrived British units, creating a mixed command structure that complicated defensive coordination. Then when German artillery opened fire on the Western Salient, both Australian and British troops occupied adjacent positions, fighting under different command chains with varying levels of experience on the same terrain. The Australian troops knew immediately how to respond, moving to fighting positions and executing procedures refined through 8 months of practice. The British troops hesitated, waiting for orders, uncertain about procedures not yet fully understood. Australian sergeants found themselves shouting instructions to British soldiers they barely knew, improvising command relationships that violated doctrine but kept the defense functioning. The situation was chaotic, but ultimately held together because professional soldiers on both sides adapted to circumstances that training had never anticipated. In the destroyer voyages carrying Australians away from Tobruk followed the same dangerous pattern that had sustained the garrison since April: high-speed runs through darkness, arrival at 0200 hours, rapid embarkation, while German artillery sporadically targeted the harbor, then departure before dawn brought Luftwaffe attacks. The evacuating soldiers carried personal weapons and minimal equipment, leaving behind heavy weapons, vehicles, and supplies for the British units replacing them. They boarded destroyers by climbing scramble nets thrown over the sides, a procedure that was routine for sailors, but terrifying for soldiers unfamiliar with ships and the Mediterranean swells that made the nets swing unpredictably. Men fell, suffering injuries that added to the casualty lists in the final weeks of Australian service. The destroyers departed overloaded, decks crowded with soldiers who had nowhere to sit except on each other, riding waves that made many immediately seasick. The voyage to Alexandria took approximately 11 hours, delivering exhausted soldiers to rear areas where they would begin the process of recovering from 8 months of siege. Lieutenant Colonel Burrows commanded the last Australian unit to leave Tobruk, departing on December 1st after delays that extended his battalion's service weeks beyond the planned relief date. He participated in a ceremonial handover with his British replacement, conducted in a dugout headquarters lit by oil lamps, while German artillery fire rumbled in the distance. The ceremony was brief. Burrows provided a final situation report, handed over maps and operational documents, and offered a few words about the men who had died holding this sector, then saluted and departed. The handover represented the end of Australian responsibility for Tobruk's defense, though individual Australians would return in support roles, and the symbolism of the Rats of Tobruk would outlive the garrison they had named. Burrows carried with him the unit war diary, a document recording 8 months of combat operations, casualties, and daily existence under siege conditions. The diary would eventually reach Australian military archives, becoming one of the primary sources for understanding the siege from participants' perspectives. The timing of the relief operation, stretched across 12 weeks rather than the planned 6, created exactly the vulnerability that military planners had feared. German forces attacked during the period when garrison composition was mixed, experience levels varied, and command relationships were unclear. The attack failed not because the relief had been executed perfectly, but because the defensive systems were sufficiently robust to compensate for reduced garrison effectiveness. The engineering improvements, the minefield densification, the hardened positions, and the accumulated defensive works all meant that even inexperienced troops occupying well-prepared positions could resist German assault. The engineering had bought tolerance for reduced troop quality, creating margins that allowed the defense to function through the transition period. Had the relief occurred in April when defenses were less developed, the outcome might have been very different. And the knowledge transfer from Australian veterans to British replacements proved incomplete despite extensive briefing efforts. Some knowledge resided in written documents, maps showing minefield layouts, range cards for artillery, patrol route descriptions, defensive position inventories. But much knowledge existed only in soldiers' memories and muscle memory, the understanding of which wadis provided covered approach routes for German patrols, which sounds preceded artillery barrages, which German tactics indicated probing attacks versus serious assaults, how to navigate the perimeter at night without stumbling into friendly minefields. This tacit knowledge could not be fully transferred through briefings, and its loss reduced defensive effectiveness in ways difficult to quantify but certainly real. British troops would relearn these lessons through experience, suffering casualties while acquiring knowledge that their Australian predecessors had already paid to obtain. The 3-week period during November, when Australian and British units fought together under confused command arrangements, produced no major disasters, but numerous smaller failures that revealed the challenges of mid-siege garrison rotation. Artillery fire support requests were delayed when British forward observers used different radio procedures than Australian headquarters units expected. Patrols from different national units nearly engaged each other in no man's land when coordination failed. Ration distribution broke down temporarily when British supply officers did not understand the Australian logistics system they had inherited. Water allocation procedures required emergency revision when British units initially distributed water according to doctrine rather than the siege-specific rationing that Australians had developed. The problems were solved through improvisation and goodwill from soldiers on both sides, but they highlighted how complex military operations become when institutional knowledge evaporates during personnel transitions. November 20th brought an incident that crystallized the knowledge transfer problem. A British lieutenant leading his first patrol in no man's land followed a route described in written orders without understanding contextual information that Australian patrols had learned through experience. The route passed through an area where Italian wire remained uncleared, creating noise hazards that drew German attention. German listening posts detected the patrol, artillery fire was called, and the patrol suffered 3 casualties before withdrawing. An Australian sergeant who heard about the incident later commented that, "We would never use that route. Everyone knew the wire was there." But everyone meant Australian soldiers who had learned through trial and error over months. The British lieutenant did not know, because that specific detail had not appeared in the written handover documents. 3 men paid for knowledge that should have been transferred but was not. By early December, the relief operation was essentially complete, with 68% of the original Australian garrison evacuated to rear areas. Approximately 14,000 Australians had departed Tobruk, and replaced by 12,000 British troops from the 70th Division, plus reinforcements and specialists who filled specific capability gaps. The Polish Carpathian Brigade remained, having received no relief despite service equivalent to the Australians. The garrison composition had fundamentally changed, transforming from a predominantly Australian force with British and Polish elements to a predominantly British force with Polish elements. The changed composition would shape the siege's final phase, though by December, the siege itself was entering its final weeks as Operation Crusader developed, and German forces began withdrawing from positions surrounding Tobruk. The last Australians leaving Tobruk carried memories they would spend lifetimes processing. They had served 8 months under siege conditions, lost hundreds of comrades to combat and disease, endured bombardment and deprivation that tested human endurance, and earned a reputation for defensive tenacity that would define Australian military identity for generations. They departed, knowing they had succeeded in their mission. Tobruk had held when holding mattered most, but they also departed carrying trauma that 1941 medicine barely recognized and could not effectively treat. Many would struggle with what would later be called post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulty readjusting to civilian life after the war. The psychological cost of the siege would accumulate over decades, appearing in medical records, in veterans' testimonies, and in the statistics of early deaths and mental illness among survivors. The last men leaving Tobruk in December 1941 believed they were going to safety and rest. They did not yet understand that parts of themselves would remain in those desert trenches forever, and that the siege would never truly end for those who had endured it. April 11th, 1941. Erwin Rommel sat in his command vehicle studying a calendar where he had written 3 words in bold script: Tobruk, 3 days. The notation represented his confident prediction that the fortress would fall within 72 hours of initial assault. The calendar page would never be discarded. Rommel kept it throughout the campaign, the writing growing increasingly faded, but the message remaining as a reminder of the promise he could not fulfill. His staff officers watched the calendar become something approaching a talisman, into a symbol of the commander's determination that gradually transformed into evidence of obsession. By November, the 3-day prediction had stretched to 8 months of siege with no resolution in sight. Rommel still spoke of taking Tobruk as though success was inevitable, ignoring the mounting evidence that the fortress had become unattainable with available resources. The line between determination and illusion had blurred. The pattern established itself within weeks of the first failed assault. When April attacks were repulsed, Rommel immediately began planning renewed efforts for May. When May attacks achieved only limited penetration before being contained, he commenced planning for June operations. Each failure prompted not reconsideration, but intensified effort. It is as though willpower alone could overcome mathematical constraints of insufficient forces, inadequate supplies, and defensive improvements that made Tobruk stronger with each passing month. Staff officers who suggested bypassing Tobruk and advancing into Egypt with available forces faced Rommel's angry rejection. The suggestion that German prestige could accept leaving a fortified position in the rear, unsubdued, seemed impossible for Rommel to consider. Tobruk had become the focus of his operational thinking, to the exclusion of alternatives that might have better served strategic objectives. The casualty figures from repeated assault attempts accumulated into a ledger that revealed the cost of Rommel's fixation. Between April and December 1941, German forces attacking Tobruk suffered approximately 3,800 killed and wounded from causes directly attributable to assault operations. This figure excluded casualties from ongoing siege operations, from artillery exchanges, from patrol actions, and from the disease and environmental factors that affected both sides. The 3,800 represented soldiers killed or wounded in deliberate attacks that failed to achieve their objectives. For comparison, the entire Afrika Korps numbered approximately 50,000 German troops at maximum strength. Rommel had expended nearly 8% of his force attacking a position that remained in Allied hands despite the sacrifice. The mathematics were devastating, yet the attacks continued, and tank losses told a parallel story of resources consumed for minimal gain. 94 German tanks were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair in attacks on Tobruk between April and November. Each Panzer Mark III or Mark IV represented months of German industrial production, specialized training for crews, logistical investment in spare parts and ammunition, and tactical capability essential for mobile operations in desert warfare. The tanks lost at Tobruk were tanks unavailable for other operations, gaps in armored strength that could not be quickly replaced given the supply constraints affecting all Axis operations in North Africa. Staff officers maintained inventories showing tank strength declining, while operational demands remained constant or increased. The inventories demonstrated mathematically what Rommel seemed unwilling to accept emotionally. The Afrika Korps was consuming itself against Tobruk's defenses. Rommel personally spent an estimated 60 cumulative days observing Tobruk from forward command posts, time that would normally be divided among all sectors of a theater command. The time investment revealed his priorities more clearly than any written order. He observed attacks through binoculars, visited forward units during lulls in fighting, studied terrain from every possible angle seeking the weak point that would permit breakthrough. His presence inspired German troops who saw their commander sharing their dangers, but it also represented command attention diverted from broader strategic concerns. While Rommel focused on Tobruk, and other sectors of the North African theater received less oversight, logistical problems multiplied without senior leadership attention, and strategic opportunities elsewhere went unexploited because the commander's mind remained fixed on 30 miles of Libyan perimeter. The diversion of resources from other operations became quantifiable by midsummer. 2 divisions, approximately 30% of the Afrika Korps' combat strength, were committed to siege operations around Tobruk. These divisions conducted limited offensive operations, while British forces in Egypt prepared for eventual relief operations without significant German interference. Intelligence assessments later suggested that Rommel could have advanced toward the Suez Canal in June or July, with forces instead committed to besieging Tobruk, potentially achieving strategic objectives that would have altered the entire North African campaign. The counterfactual cannot be proven, but the resource allocation is documented fact. Rommel chose to invest divisional strength in siege operations rather than mobile warfare that suited German doctrine and his own tactical preferences. Tobruk had become the mission rather than an obstacle to the mission. German staff meetings from July onward showed increasing tension between Rommel and subordinate officers who questioned the continued focus on Tobruk. Minutes from these meetings reveal frank exchanges where logistics officers presented supply figures demonstrating insufficient resources for sustained siege operations, where intelligence officers reported Allied strength building in Egypt, and where operational planners suggested alternative strategies that did not require taking Tobruk. Rommel's responses, documented in meeting notes and personal correspondence, reflected growing irritation with subordinates who lacked offensive spirit or failed to understand the necessity of eliminating the Tobruk garrison. The exchanges illustrated a commander increasingly isolated in his judgment, unable or unwilling to incorporate information that contradicted his fixed conclusions about operational priorities. Berlin's reaction to Rommel's Tobruk fixation evolved from initial support to growing concern to eventual attempts at intervention. High command directives sent in July and August explicitly ordered Rommel to adopt defensive postures, conserve resources, and await reinforcements before conducting major offensive operations. Now, the directives carefully avoided direct criticism of Rommel's leadership, but clearly implied that Berlin judged his priorities misaligned with broader strategic requirements. Rommel acknowledged these directives, filed them, and continued planning attacks on Tobruk. His ability to ignore or creatively reinterpret orders from Berlin demonstrated both the independence that made him effective and the insubordination that eventually undermined his position. The pattern would repeat throughout his North African service. Orders received, acknowledged, then effectively disregarded when they conflicted with Rommel's judgment. The November offensive represented Rommel's final major attempt to take Tobruk before external pressures forced him to choose between the siege and defending against Operation Crusader. He committed maximum available forces, accepted casualty rates that would have terminated operations under peacetime constraints, and pushed attacks beyond the point where success remained plausible. When the offensive failed and intelligence confirmed that British forces threatened encirclement, Rommel personally ordered the withdrawal. Staff officers present during the order session later described Rommel as appearing physically aged, his voice lacking the characteristic energy that normally accompanied his commands. The withdrawal from Tobruk represented not just tactical failure, but the collapse of 8 months of effort, sacrifice, and increasingly desperate commitment to an objective that had consumed resources beyond any rational calculation of value. The psychological portrait that emerges from examining Rommel's Tobruk fixation reveals a commander whose greatest strength became his fatal weakness. The audacity that made him successful during the French campaign and the initial North African advances translated into inflexibility when circumstances required adaptation. The confidence that inspired his troops became overconfidence that ignored mathematical constraints. The determination that won battles became obsession that lost campaigns. Tobruk was Rommel's first significant failure, and he responded not with recalibration, but with redoubled effort, demonstrating a personality type that could not easily accept defeat or adjust to limitations. The sage revealed character traits that would recur throughout his career: brilliance in mobile operations, weakness in logistics, its susceptibility to fixation, and ultimate inability to subordinate tactical preferences to strategic necessities. June 1942 would bring a different outcome when Rommel finally captured Tobruk during a second siege under vastly different circumstances. His radio message to Berlin announcing the capture contained just 2 words: "At last." The phrasing revealed everything about his relationship to Tobruk: relief, vindication, satisfaction at finally achieving the objective that had eluded him a year earlier. But the 1942 capture came too late to affect the 1941 campaign, and the resources consumed in the earlier siege contributed to weaknesses that would manifest at El Alamein and in the ultimate Axis defeat in North Africa. A Tobruk in 1941 represented more than tactical failure for Rommel. It represented the first clear evidence that the commander who had seemed invincible was fallible, that audacity without adequate resources produced defeat rather than victory, and that personal determination could not overcome operational mathematics. The obsession with Tobruk damaged Rommel's reputation, consumed the Africa Corps' strength, and foreshadowed the pattern of brilliant tactical operations undermined by strategic miscalculation that would characterize his remaining service. The fortress that should have fallen in 3 days instead held for 8 months, and in that failure lay the seeds of everything that followed. November 18th, 1941. The British Eighth Army crossed the Egyptian frontier into Libya with 118,000 men, 700 tanks, and artillery support on a scale not previously seen in the North African campaign. Operation Crusader had begun, the long-planned offensive designed to relieve Tobruk and destroy Rommel's Africa Corps in a decisive battle of annihilation. Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham commanded the operation from headquarters in Egypt, coordinating 3 corps advancing on multiple axes toward objectives that included engaging German armor, relieving the Tobruk garrison, and recapturing Cyrenaica. The operation represented Britain's first major offensive in North Africa after months of defensive operations and withdrawals. Everything depended on success. Failure would leave Tobruk besieged indefinitely, strengthen Axis control of Libya, and potentially force British withdrawal from Egypt. The offensive that should have been launched months earlier was finally underway, and tens of thousands of soldiers were moving west into terrain that would determine the North African campaign's trajectory. The strategic concept behind Operation Crusader emphasized mobile warfare conducted by armored formations, operating with greater freedom than German forces whose movements were constrained by the Tobruk siege. British planners recognized that Rommel had committed substantial forces to containing Tobruk, forces that could not be easily redirected once Crusader commenced. The plan called for the 13th Corps to pin German and Italian forces along the frontier, while the 30th Corps, containing most of the British armor, swept wide to the south and turned north and advanced toward Tobruk from the west. If executed successfully, the maneuver would place British armored divisions between Rommel's forces and their supply lines, forcing the Africa Corps to fight at disadvantage or withdraw. The Tobruk garrison would simultaneously conduct a breakout operation, advancing from the perimeter to link up with relieving forces and trapping German units in between. The first days of Crusader developed in chaos that nearly produced British disaster rather than victory. British armored divisions advancing west encountered German forces on November 19th near Sidi Rezek, approximately 12 miles southeast of Tobruk. The engagement evolved into a series of meeting battles where British numerical superiority was offset by superior German tactical coordination and tank crew training. The 22nd Armored Brigade suffered severe casualties when it attacked dug-in German anti-tank positions without adequate reconnaissance, losing over half its tanks in an afternoon. The 4th Armored Brigade achieved better results but could not sustain momentum against German counterattacks. By November 21st, British armored strength had been significantly reduced, and Cunningham was considering whether to continue the offensive or withdraw to preserve remaining forces. November 26th brought the moment that changed the operation's trajectory. The New Zealand Division, advancing from the southeast as part of the 13th Corps, pushed through Italian defensive positions and established radio contact with the Tobruk garrison. The distance between New Zealand forward positions and Tobruk's perimeter measured approximately 12 miles, close enough for potential link-up, but still separated by German forces holding blocking positions. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical significance. Soldiers who had endured 8 months of siege could hear relief forces on their radios, could see dust from vehicle movements on the horizon, could calculate that rescue measured in miles rather than months. The garrison prepared for breakout operations that would finally end the isolation they had endured since April. The Tobruk garrison's breakout began on November 27th, with the British 70th Division and supporting armor rolling through gaps in the perimeter that had been held as defensive minefields for 8 months. Engineers cleared paths through obstacles they had previously laid, a task that required intimate knowledge of minefield patterns and extraordinary care to avoid triggering the varied defenses they had created. The breakout force numbered approximately 8,000 infantry with 22 tanks, a modest force by Crusader standards, but representing the maximum strength the garrison could commit while maintaining perimeter defense against potential German counterattacks. The breakout advanced approximately 6 miles before encountering German positions and engaging in firefights that would continue for 3 days before final link-up was achieved. Rommel's response to Crusader demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his strategic limitations. Rather than immediately withdrawing from Tobruk to consolidate forces against the British offensive, he attempted to maintain the siege while simultaneously conducting counteroffensive operations against Crusader forces. The approach divided German strength. creating vulnerabilities that British commanders could exploit if they recognized the opportunity. Rommel personally led an armored thrust toward the Egyptian frontier in late November, attempting to create panic and force British withdrawal. The thrust achieved tactical surprise but failed strategically because British commanders, after initial confusion, maintained their focus on relieving Tobruk rather than reacting to German maneuvers designed to distract and divert. December 10th, 1941, 0800 hours. A New Zealand officer from the 6th Brigade met a British officer from the Tobruk garrison at a checkpoint on the coastal road 6 miles east of the fortress. The officers shook hands, exchanged situation reports, and confirmed that the link-up was official. The Siege of Tobruk had ended after 242 days. The moment was undramatic, almost anticlimactic after months of sustained combat. No ceremonies marked the occasion, no speeches were delivered. 2 officers met, confirmed they represented forces that had successfully linked up, then returned to their respective units to continue operations against German forces that remained dangerous despite losing their siege positions. The siege ended not with thunder, but with a handshake and routine military professionalism. The casualties suffered during the link-up operations, and Crusaders' opening weeks demonstrated how costly even successful operations became in desert warfare. Crusader forces suffered approximately 897 killed and wounded in the fighting that achieved Tobruk's relief, figures that excluded losses from the larger battle ongoing across Cyrenaica. The Tobruk garrison's breakout added another 200 casualties to British losses. German casualties in the same period approached 1,000 killed and wounded, with substantial additional losses in prisoners, as some units were isolated and forced to surrender when Rommel ordered general withdrawal. The casualty exchange remained relatively even, despite British advantages in numbers and initiative, and reflecting German tactical effectiveness that persisted even under strategic disadvantage. Rommel's withdrawal from Tobruk commenced on December 10th and continued through mid-December, as Axis forces fell back to the Gazala line, approximately 40 miles west of Tobruk, then to El Agila when that position proved untenable against continued British pressure. The withdrawal abandoned siege positions that had been occupied since April, surrendered terrain that German forces had held for 8 months, and represented strategic defeat regardless of tactical successes achieved during the retreat. German officers conducting the withdrawal implemented demolitions designed to deny British use of facilities around Tobruk, destroying supplies that could not be evacuated, mining approach routes, and creating obstacles intended to delay British pursuit. The thoroughness of German demolitions reflected professional military practice, but also suggested recognition that return to these positions was unlikely in the foreseeable future. The strategic implications of Crusader and Tobruk's relief extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Libya. The operation demonstrated that British forces could conduct successful offensive operations against German opponents, reversing the narrative of continuous defeat that had prevailed through 1941. The relief of Tobruk validated the decision to hold the fortress despite enormous costs, proving that the strategic value justified the investment in lives, ships, and resources. The operation forced Rommel into defensive postures and retreat, all buying time for British forces to build strength for subsequent operations. Perhaps most importantly, Crusader proved that German forces in North Africa were not invincible, that they could be defeated through combination of superior numbers, adequate planning, and persistence despite setbacks. The psychological impact on both sides would shape operations throughout 1942. The counterfactual question remained unanswerable but compelling. Would Crusader have succeeded if Tobruk had fallen earlier in the siege? The garrison's presence throughout the siege had tied down German forces that might otherwise have been available to defend against the British offensive. The fortress had served as a magnet attracting Rommel's attention and resources, creating vulnerabilities that Crusader exploited. And staff officers in Cairo, who had planned the operation, acknowledged that Tobruk's continued resistance had been essential to creating conditions where relief became possible. A garrison that had collapsed in May or June would have freed German forces to strengthen positions elsewhere, potentially making Crusader too costly to attempt. The siege and the relief operation were interconnected. Each made the other possible, and success required both the defenders' endurance and the relief forces' eventual advance. December 10th marked the official end of the Tobruk siege, but fighting continued across the region for weeks as Crusader developed into a larger campaign. The siege had lasted 242 days, making it one of the longest defensive sieges of the Second World War. The defenders had sustained casualties. They suffered deprivation, endured bombardment, and fought off repeated German assaults. The besiegers had consumed resources, suffered their own casualties, and ultimately failed to achieve the objective that had obsessed their commander for 8 months. Both sides could claim partial success. The Allies held Tobruk. The Germans had tied down Allied forces and delayed their advance. But measured against original objectives, the siege represented clear Allied victory. Tobruk had been held when holding mattered most, and that achievement would shape everything that followed in North Africa. The siege was over. The costs remained to be calculated. April 1943. At the war cemetery at Tobruk, received its final burials as Commonwealth Graves Commission workers completed the consolidation of scattered battlefield graves into organized rows of white headstones. 2,479 markers stood in precise alignment, each bearing a name, rank, unit, and date of death. The cemetery overlooked the Mediterranean from a slight rise inland from the harbor, positioned where sea breezes moderated the desert heat, and the sound of waves provided constant background to the silence. The workers moved systematically through remaining tasks, leveling ground, planting vegetation that might survive in this climate, installing markers that would endure for decades. Each headstone represented an individual story that ended in the Libyan desert, none a life interrupted by war in a place most of these men had never heard of before military service brought them here. The numbers were precise. The human cost remained incalculable. The casualty statistics compiled after the siege revealed losses that varied significantly by nationality and timing. Australian forces suffered 749 killed during their service in Tobruk from April through December 1941, representing approximately 5% of the Australian garrison strength. British forces lost 432, killed during the same period, though many British units served shorter durations than their Australian counterparts. Indian troops suffered 201 killed. The Polish Carpathian Brigade recorded 123 killed, despite receiving no relief throughout the entire siege. These figures counted only deaths directly attributable to combat or siege conditions, excluding soldiers who died later from wounds or diseases contracted during their service. The total killed approached 1,500 from a garrison that never exceeded 36,000, a casualty rate of approximately 4%, killed over 8 months of continuous operations. The wounded numbers told a different story about the siege's human cost. 2,951 soldiers were wounded seriously enough to require evacuation or extended hospitalization during the siege. Many wounds were caused by artillery fragments. It's the most common cause of casualties in static defensive warfare, where soldiers occupied positions subject to regular bombardment. Others resulted from small arms fire during patrols and local attacks, from mine detonations during engineering operations or movement through inadequately marked minefields, and from accidents with weapons and equipment under the stressful conditions of siege operations. The wounded who survived often carried permanent disabilities, amputations from mine injuries, blindness from shell fragments, traumatic brain injuries from concussion, and the psychological wounds that 1941 medicine barely recognized and could not effectively treat. The Axis casualties proved harder to document with precision because German and Italian records were incomplete, destroyed, or remained inaccessible in archives. Estimates based on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and post-war research suggest approximately 5,400 German and Italian soldiers were killed or died from wounds received during siege operations around Tobruk. The higher axis casualty figures reflected the nature of siege warfare, where attackers crossing open ground under defensive fire suffered disproportionate losses compared to defenders in prepared positions. German casualties concentrated during the major assault operations in April, May, and November, when attacking forces accepted heavy losses attempting to achieve breakthrough. Italian casualties were distributed more evenly across the siege, as Italian units held static positions subject to British patrol actions and artillery fire, but rarely conducted major offensive operations. The medical consequences that extended beyond immediate battlefield casualties revealed themselves slowly over subsequent years and decades. Medical officers tracking the health of Tobruk veterans documented that 40% of soldiers who served in the siege suffered chronic dysentery or related gastrointestinal disorders for years after their service ended. The bacterial infections contracted from contaminated water and inadequate sanitation created long-term health problems that persisted despite treatment. Weight loss during the siege averaged 18 pounds per soldier, and many veterans never fully recovered their pre-siege body weight or physical condition. Dental problems flourished from poor nutrition and lack of proper hygiene facilities. Respiratory diseases developed from constant exposure to dust and poor air quality in underground positions. The physical deterioration was measurable, documented in medical records that tracked declining health among men who should have been in their physical prime. The strategic delays imposed on Axis operations represented one of Tobruk's most significant, though least visible, contributions to Allied victory in North Africa. Rommel's commitment to besieging Tobruk consumed 8 months that might otherwise have been used advancing toward the Suez Canal or preparing defensive positions against the eventual British offensive. Staff calculations conducted after the war estimated the delay at minimum 8 months. Comparing the actual timeline to counterfactual scenarios, where Tobruk fell quickly and German forces could advance immediately into Egypt. 8 months allowed British forces in Egypt to receive reinforcements, build defensive positions, stockpile supplies, and prepare for offensive operations that would eventually drive Axis forces from North Africa entirely. The delay had strategic value that exceeded any tactical contribution the garrison made through defensive operations. The naval losses sustained while supplying Tobruk represented investment that approached the limits of sustainability for Royal Navy operations in the Mediterranean. 27 destroyers were sunk or damaged beyond economical repair during supply operations to Tobruk between April and December 1941. 4 cruisers were lost in operations related to supporting or covering the supply runs. Each destroyer cost approximately £2 million in 1941 currency, a financial investment that totaled over £50 million in ships alone, excluding trained crews, fuel, ammunition, and operational costs. The investment could be justified only if Tobruk's continued resistance produced strategic value exceeding the cost of maintaining it. Post-war analysis generally concluded the investment was justified, but the margin was closer than contemporary decision-makers understood when they committed forces to the supply operations. The total supplies delivered by sea to Tobruk during the siege measured 72,000 tons, carried in increments of 50 tons per destroyer voyage. The supplies included everything necessary to sustain military operations: ammunition that kept defensive weapons operational, food that prevented starvation though not malnutrition, water when local sources failed, medical supplies that saved lives and treated diseases, fuel for generators and vehicles, and the mail that sustained morale through connection to distant homes. 72,000 tons represented the minimum necessary to keep the garrison functional. Had supply delivery fallen significantly below this level, the defense would have collapsed from resource exhaustion regardless of German actions. The margin between sufficiency and failure measured perhaps 10%, a remarkably narrow safety factor for an operation lasting 8 months. The reunion held in Sydney, Australia, in 1965 brought together survivors of the siege 24 years after the events they commemorated. Approximately 800 former rats of Tobruk attended, men now in their 40s and 50s, many bringing families who had heard siege stories but never fully understood the experience their fathers and husbands described. The veterans looked at photographs displayed at the reunion, showing themselves at age 25, lean, hard, sunburned young men, posed near defensive positions or standing beside vehicles. They compared those images to their present selves, middle-aged, overweight in some cases, hair graying or gone, wearing civilian clothes that marked the distance between soldiers they had been and civilians they had become. The photographs documented transformation that exceeded simple aging. The young men in the photographs had been shaped by experiences their middle-aged selves were still processing. The medical records from reunion attendees revealed patterns that suggested long-term health consequences from siege service. The veterans showed higher than average rates of gastrointestinal disorders, respiratory diseases, anxiety and depression, and stress-related conditions that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Life expectancy for Tobruk. Veterans proved slightly lower than demographically similar populations who had not served in siege conditions, though the differences were statistically modest and subject to multiple interpretations. Some veterans reported nightmares that persisted for decades, dreams of artillery bombardments, of thirst in the desert, of watching friends die, days of being trapped underground while explosions shook the earth above. The dreams eventually faded for most, but never disappeared entirely. The siege had marked them permanently in ways both visible and invisible. The question of whether Tobruk was worth it generated debate among military historians that continued for decades after the war ended. Supporters argued the garrison tied down Axis forces, delayed Rommel's advance, provided a symbolic victory when Allied morale desperately needed encouragement, and created conditions that made Operation Crusader possible. Critics noted the enormous naval losses, the resources consumed maintaining a garrison that never conducted major offensive operations, and questioned whether similar strategic effects could have been achieved through alternative deployments of the forces committed to Tobruk. About the debate remained unresolved because counterfactual history cannot be proven. There is no way to know what would have occurred if Tobruk had been evacuated in April 1941, or if different strategic choices had been made. The Commonwealth soldiers buried in Tobruk War Cemetery represented only a fraction of those whose lives were permanently altered by siege service. For every soldier killed, several were wounded. For every soldier wounded, dozens suffered diseases or injuries that left permanent marks. For every physical casualty, hundreds carried psychological scars that shaped their post-war lives in ways families and societies struggle to understand. The 2,479 headstones were visible memorials to sacrifice. The survivors carried invisible memorials and memories, nightmares, and the daily struggle to reconcile who they had been during the siege with who they needed to become in peacetime. The strategic map of North Africa in 1941 and 1942 showed the 8-month delay visibly in the timing of Axis advances. Rommel reached Tobruk in April 1941. He did not advance significantly beyond that position until June 1942, a delay of 14 months from initial contact to resume defensive operations toward Egypt. 8 of those 14 months were consumed by the siege, attempting to reduce a fortress that tactical success could not capture and strategic necessity could not bypass. The delay gave British forces the time they desperately needed to prepare defenses at El Alamein, to receive American equipment after the United States entered the war, and to build the overwhelming material superiority that would eventually crush Axis forces in North Africa. Tobruk's 8-month resistance purchased time measured in months, but valued in the outcome of entire campaigns. The cost of holding Tobruk was terrible: 1,500 dead, 3,000 wounded, 27 destroyers lost, 72,000 tons of supplies consumed, 8 months of human suffering under siege conditions. The strategic benefit was substantial but difficult to quantify precisely. Delayed Axis advance, tied down enemy forces, provided symbolic victory, created conditions for eventual relief and counteroffensive. The accounting balanced only if one accepted that strategic advantage justified the human and material cost, a judgment that depended ultimately on values rather than mathematics. The soldiers who died defending Tobruk did not choose whether their sacrifice would be worthwhile. They died following orders, doing their duty, and trusting that the strategic purposes they served justified what was asked of them. Whether that trust was warranted remained a question each person had to answer, according to their own understanding of what the Second World War required and what human life was worth. February 1942. German staff officers planning defensive operations at Stalingrad reviewed intelligence summaries describing Soviet siege tactics and British success in sustaining the Tobruk garrison despite 8 months of German encirclement. The summaries explicitly referenced the Tobruk mistake, the commitment of substantial forces to siege operations that consume resources without achieving objectives while tying down troops needed elsewhere. The Stalingrad planners understood that cities could not necessarily be taken by assault if defenders possessed adequate supplies and will to resist, that sieges consumed attacking forces as effectively as defending forces, and that maintaining supply lines into besieged positions could sustain resistance indefinitely if sea or air access remained open. The lessons from Tobruk informed German planning throughout subsequent operations, though whether those lessons were correctly applied remained questionable. The siege in Libya had become a case study in how modern warfare made traditional siege operations potentially unwinnable for attackers. The French experience at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 reflected both understanding and misunderstanding of Tobruk's lessons. French commanders establishing the fortified position in northern Vietnam explicitly cited Tobruk as precedent for creating a defensive base that could be supplied by air and used as a magnet to attract enemy forces into attritional battles. The concept seemed sound: defend a position using firepower and fortifications, while supply aircraft maintain logistics, forcing the enemy to attack prepared defenses where superior French weaponry would inflict disproportionate casualties. The critical difference that French planners apparently underestimated was supply capacity. At Tobruk had been supplied by fast destroyers, making nighttime runs carrying 50 tons per voyage, with total deliveries reaching 72,000 tons over 8 months. Dien Bien Phu relied on aircraft with much smaller individual cargo capacity, operating in weather conditions and under anti-aircraft fire that reduced delivery rates below what the garrison required. The position fell after 57 days when supplies ran out and French forces could no longer sustain resistance. Tobruk's lesson about sea-supplied fortresses did not translate directly to air-supplied positions when transport capacity proved inadequate. British planning for the Falklands War in 1982 showed more sophisticated understanding of Tobruk's implications for modern amphibious operations. And staff officers reviewing options for retaking the Falkland Islands from Argentine occupation explicitly referenced Tobruk as precedent for maintaining military operations at extreme distance from home bases using naval supply lines vulnerable to enemy interdiction. The analysis focused on calculating required shipping capacity, acceptable loss rates for supply vessels, and minimum garrison strength necessary to hold positions while supplied exclusively by sea. The Falklands operation succeeded partly because planners had studied historical precedents like Tobruk and understood the logistics mathematics that determined whether distant operations could be sustained. The Royal Navy in 1982 performed essentially the same function the Royal Navy had performed in 1941, maintaining sea bridges across hostile waters to supply forces that could not survive without continuous resupply. The doctrinal changes implemented by military organizations worldwide after the Second World War reflected lessons derived partly from Tobruk and similar siege operations. Emphasis shifted toward all-around defense rather than linear fortifications, recognizing that modern mobile warfare could attack from any direction, and that defensive positions required capability to resist encirclement. Minefield density standards increased based on calculations showing the relationship between mine concentration and probability of stopping armored assault. Anti-tank ditch specifications were revised to account for improved armored vehicles with better trench crossing capabilities. The defensive engineering that had evolved during the Tobruk siege became formalized in doctrine that trained officers worldwide learned and applied in subsequent conflicts. The improvised solutions developed under combat pressure in Libya became standardized procedures taught in military academies. 47 staff colleges worldwide eventually incorporated Tobruk as a case study in their curricula, teaching the siege to officers seeking to understand defensive operations, logistics under constraints, siege warfare, coalition command relationships, and the interaction between tactical operations and strategic objectives. The case study presentations varied by institutional perspective. At British colleges emphasized the successful defense and naval supply operations. German colleges examined Rommel's decisions and the resource constraints that prevented success. Australian institutions focused on the national significance of the Rats of Tobruk, and logisticians studied the mathematics of maintaining operations at extreme distance from bases. Each perspective revealed different aspects of the siege, demonstrating how single events could support multiple interpretations, depending on analytical framework and institutional priorities. The strategic influence of Tobruk extended beyond specific tactical lessons to broader understanding of naval power's role in continental warfare. The siege demonstrated that naval supremacy could enable land operations that would otherwise be impossible, that control of sea lines of communication could sustain isolated forces indefinitely, and that naval forces could impose costs on land-based enemies through interdiction of supply lines even when direct naval combat was limited. These principles informed NATO planning during the Cold War, American operations in the Pacific throughout the 20th century, and the general understanding that maritime nations possessed asymmetric advantages in projecting and sustaining military power globally. Tobruk became one of the clearer historical examples of how naval power translated into land warfare success. The Rats of Tobruk Association grew from its joking origins during the siege into a substantial veterans organization that peaked at 8,200 members in 1960. The association provided social connection for veterans who shared experiences difficult to explain to those who had not endured siege conditions. Annual reunions brought together men scattered across Australia, Britain, Poland, and other nations, creating temporary communities bound by memories of Tobruk. The association also provided welfare support for veterans experiencing financial hardship, medical problems, or psychological difficulties related to their wartime service. As membership aged and members died, the association's functions evolved toward commemoration and historical preservation. The final reunion occurred in 2009, with 23 surviving members attending, men in their late 80s and 90s, whose numbers diminished with each passing year. Australian Military Academy cadets visiting Tobruk in 2009 walked the perimeter that their nation's soldiers had defended 68 years earlier. The cadets were accompanied by guides who explained the defensive layout, pointed out preserved fortifications, and described the siege's major events. The perimeter itself remained visible, concrete pillboxes weathered but intact, anti-tank ditches partially filled but still recognizable, sections of wire obstacles rusted but present. The cadets attempted to comprehend what their predecessors had endured, imagining 8 months of siege while walking terrain that revealed little about the human experience beyond physical evidence of fortifications and fighting positions. The guides emphasized that the Rats of Tobruk had held this ground under conditions the cadets could not truly understand despite their military training. The visit was educational, but also ritualistic, connecting contemporary soldiers to traditions established by their predecessors' wartime service. The last surviving rat of Tobruk, Arthur Leggett, died in 2014 at age 103. His death marked the end of living connection to the siege, the transition from memory to history that occurs when final participants pass and events become entirely dependent on written records, photographs, and artifacts for preservation. Leggett had been a signaler during the siege, manning radio equipment that maintained communication between headquarters and forward positions. He survived the siege, the war, returned to Australia, and lived a long civilian life as a postal worker, while maintaining connection to fellow veterans through the Rats of Tobruk Association. His obituaries noted his siege service and his status as last survivor, transforming an individual life into symbolic representation of an entire generation's experience. With his death, Tobruk became definitively historical rather than living memory. The cultural legacy of Tobruk in Australian national memory exceeded the siege's military significance. The Rats of Tobruk became symbols of Australian military capability, determination under adversity, and national character traits that Australians valued: independence, humor and difficulty, loyalty to comrades, and willingness to resist superior forces. The siege featured prominently in school curricula, in national commemorations, in films and documentaries, attempting to capture the experience, and in the ongoing construction of Australian national identity. Whether this cultural memory accurately reflected historical reality became almost irrelevant. The memory served purposes beyond historical accuracy, providing stories that helped Australians understand themselves and their place in global affairs. The Rats of Tobruk transcended history to become mythology, a transformation that often occurs when events are culturally useful, regardless of complete historical fidelity. Yet the question of what made Tobruk memorable when other sieges were forgotten had multiple answers. The siege's length distinguished it. 242 days was long enough to seem extraordinary in a war where most engagements measured duration in days or weeks. The successful defense during a period when Allied forces were suffering mostly defeats provided narrative satisfaction and symbolic importance. The colorful nickname, Rats of Tobruk, created memorable identity that other sieges lacked. The multinational garrison allowed multiple nations to claim shared ownership of the achievement. The operational significance within the North African campaign gave the siege strategic importance beyond merely local interest. And the siege occurred during a period when media coverage and public attention to wartime events created awareness that, earlier or later, sieges might not have generated. Tobruk became famous partly because of what happened there, and partly because circumstances made fame possible. The engineering lessons from Tobruk influenced defensive doctrine development throughout the mid-20th century, though the influence is difficult to trace through direct citations because military doctrine evolves through accumulated experience rather than single authoritative sources. The demonstrated effectiveness of dense minefields, the importance of interlocking fields of fire, the value of prepared fallback positions, the necessity of overhead cover against artillery, and the relationship between obstacle density and assault costs all became incorporated into standard defensive engineering practice. Officers planning defensive positions in subsequent conflicts applied principles derived partly from Tobruk without necessarily recognizing the historical source. The siege's engineering aspects became part of the cumulative knowledge base that informed military practice worldwide. The ultimate question remained: what did Tobruk prove that was not already known? Modern warfare made sieges potentially unwinnable for attackers who lacked overwhelming force and adequate supplies. Naval power could sustain land positions indefinitely if sea access remained open. Determined defenders in prepared positions could resist superior forces. Logistics ultimately determined operational outcomes more than tactical skill. None of these lessons were entirely new. Military theorists had understood these principles to varying degrees before Tobruk. What the siege provided was dramatic illustration under combat conditions, demonstrating theoretically known principles through practical application that could not be dismissed as academic speculation. Tobruk proved what was suspected, validated what was theorized, and demonstrated through 8 months of sustained operations that modern defensive warfare favored defenders possessing adequate supplies and will to resist. The proof was written in casualty lists, in Rommel's failures, and in the 242 days that the garrison held ground, everyone expected them to lose. The Siege of Tobruk ended in December 1941, but its consequences rippled forward through subsequent campaigns, through doctrinal evolution, through national memories, and through the lives of men who served there. The fortress that shouldn't exist became the fortress that proved it must exist, demonstrating that strategic geography combined with human determination could resist superior forces when supported by adequate logistics. The lessons were learned, were taught, were applied in subsequent conflicts, and gradually became integrated into the broader understanding of how modern warfare functions. The Rats of Tobruk became symbols that transcended their individual experiences, representing principles and values that extended far beyond 30 miles of Libyan perimeter. The siege changed siege warfare by demonstrating its limitations, all proving that modern forces could sustain isolated positions indefinitely, and that attackers could no longer assume that encirclement guaranteed eventual success. The fortress held. The lesson remained. And 80 years later, military professionals still study Tobruk to understand what happens when determination meets mathematics, when human will confronts logistical constraints, and when the defense of a harbor in the desert becomes a turning point in global conflict. The siege was over. The legacy endures.